There is an island in the Pacific where the coral meets the cane fields, where ancient stone walls run alongside terraced hillsides, and where the wind off the East China Sea carries, on certain evenings, a quality of stillness that feels almost ceremonial. It is not a large island. You could drive its length in a single, unhurried morning. Its name, in the language of the people who have lived there for centuries, carries meanings that translate roughly as something like a rope in the open sea, a thread of land floating between worlds, belonging entirely to neither. And yet in the spring of 1945, more human beings converged on that small rope of coral and limestone than had ever gathered in one place in the entire history of the Pacific War. More ships, more aircraft, more artillery, more fear, more hope, more desperation, on every side, than any of the commanders who ordered it had ever managed before, or would ever manage again. What happened there, across 82 days of fighting, that ran from the 1st of April to the 22nd of June 1945, was not simply a battle. It was something closer to the distillation of an entire war. Every tactic, every terror, every human extreme that the conflict in the Pacific had produced over nearly 4 years, compressed onto one island and pushed to its final, exhausting limit. The Americans came with the largest naval armada ever assembled in the Pacific, warships so numerous that veterans who saw them from the deck of a troopship said the horizon looked as though the sea itself had grown a city. More than 500,000 men in total. Soldiers, Marines, sailors, pilots, corpsmen, all of them pointed at roughly 1,400 square kilometers of limestone ridges, flooded paddies, and cave-riddled hillsides held by a Japanese army that had spent months preparing to make every yard of it cost as much as the human mind can conceive. The Japanese did not come to win. They came to make winning unbearable. Their commander, General Mitsuru Ushijima, had looked at his maps and his orders and understood with the cold clarity of a professional soldier that the island could not be held indefinitely. So he made a different calculation. He would not defend the beaches. He would draw the Americans in, deep into the southern interior, into a belt of mutually supporting fortifications, carved directly into the rock, tunnels and bunkers and artillery positions that no amount of naval gunfire could fully destroy. And he would kill enough Americans there that the men in Washington and Tokyo would each be forced to reconsider the arithmetic of the war itself. Caught between these two forces, between one empire's drive to end a war and another's determination to prolong it at any price, were the Okinawans themselves. A people with their own language, their own history, their own kingdom, that had existed for centuries before Japan absorbed it in the final decades of the 19th century. They had been conscripted, mobilized, pressed into service as laborers and auxiliaries. They had been told by Japanese soldiers that the Americans would massacre them, and they had been told by American leaflets that they would be protected. Neither story was entirely true. Neither story prepared them for what actually came. The battle that unfolded on that island changed the course of the final months of the Second World War in ways that are still argued about by historians. It killed American commanders and Japanese commanders. It destroyed a Japanese battleship the size of a city block. It sent waves of suicide aircraft into the American fleet, in numbers that shocked even the sailors who had been fighting in the Pacific for years. It drowned American soldiers in the mud of a rainy season that turned the southern ridgelines into something that veterans said reminded them, somehow, of descriptions they had read of the First World War. The same grinding attrition, the same inability to move, the same sense that the ground itself had become the enemy. And then, when it was finally over, the numbers came in, and the people who read them understood that something had shifted permanently, not just on the island, but in the thinking of every government that still had decisions to make about how the war would end. This documentary will take you through all of it. We will follow the planners in their headquarters as they argue over maps and projections. We will follow the Marines and soldiers as they cross beaches that seem too quiet, and then discover why. We will follow the sailors on the radar picket destroyers, alone in the open ocean, watching the sky fill with aircraft that have no intention of returning home. We will follow the Okinawan civilians, sheltering in the same caves where soldiers are dying. And we will follow the commanders on both sides. Men who made enormous decisions under impossible pressure, and who paid, in the end, with everything they had. This is the kind of story that rewards patience. It is not a story with a simple arc. It does not move in a straight line from landing to victory. It moves the way the battle itself moved, forward, then stalled, then grinding, then suddenly open, then grinding again. It has moments of almost absurd quiet, followed by the worst things men have seen. It has acts of extraordinary courage, so ordinary in context that the men who performed them could not always remember them clearly afterward. If you are here for sleep, settle in. This is a long one. Nearly every major campaign of the Pacific War led to this island, and nearly every consequence of the Pacific War flowed from what happened here. You can let the words carry you. There is more than enough history on this island to fill a night. If you are here to learn, then you are in exactly the right place. The Battle of Okinawa is among the least understood major engagements of the Second World War in the popular imagination, and it deserves far more attention than it typically receives. The names of the ridges, Kakazu, Sugarloaf, Kunishi, Shuri, do not carry the same cultural weight in most countries as Iwo Jima or Normandy. But the men who fought on them, on every side, would have told you the ridges themselves did not care about cultural weight. They only cared about what you were willing to endure to take them or hold them. We have been building this documentary for a long time, sourcing the histories, the unit records, the testimony of survivors, the analysis of the strategic decisions. If this is your first time with this channel, we are glad you found it, and we would ask simply that you subscribe before you fall asleep, so that you are here when the next one comes. If you have been with us before, then you already know what kind of company you are keeping tonight. Take a breath. Find a comfortable position. One small island, 2 empires, 82 days. This is the complete history of the Battle of Okinawa. There is an island in the East China Sea that sits at the precise point where the Pacific world ends and something older begins. It stretches roughly 110 kilometers from its northern tip to its southern shore, never more than about 30 kilometers wide at its broadest point, a slender green blade of coral and limestone rising from water so blue it seems almost invented. To the northeast lies the Japanese home islands. To the west, barely 500 kilometers across open water, lies the Chinese coast. To the south, the Ryukyu chain continues in a long arc toward Formosa and the edges of Southeast Asia. Okinawa is not, by any measure, a large piece of land. But in the geography of empires, size has rarely been the determining factor. What matters is position. And in the spring of 1945, no position on Earth mattered more than this one. The island carries a character that defies easy classification. Its landscape is not uniform. The northern 2/3 are heavily forested and mountainous, ridgelines draped in subtropical jungle that swallows sound and breaks up formations, while the southern third flattens and corrugates into a different kind of terrain entirely. Low rocky ridges and terraced hillsides interlaced with a web of natural caves and underground passages carved over centuries by water moving through limestone. The soil in the south is reddish and ancient. The coastal waters are warm, rich, and treacherous with coral. The seasonal weather swings between beauty and violence, and in late spring, the island receives the kind of rains that do not simply fall, but arrive, turning the red earth to something close to liquid and reshaping the ground beneath a man's feet within hours. Before it became a battlefield, this landscape had been home to human beings for thousands of years, and those people had made something of it that the outside world rarely paused to notice. The Ryukyu Kingdom was, for several centuries, a sovereign maritime state of quiet sophistication. Its people developed a culture distinct from both China and Japan, a language of their own, a music that was particular to these islands, a tradition of craft and textile and ceremony that spoke of a people shaped by the sea and the trade routes running through it. The Ryukyuan kings maintained their court at Shuri Castle in the southern part of the main island, a structure of pale coral stone and vermilion lacquered wood that stood as a monument to a civilization that had learned the art of survival through diplomacy and commerce, rather than military conquest. The Ryukyu Kingdom paid tribute to China and traded with Japan, threading a careful political path between larger powers in a way that smaller states have always had to learn or perish. For most of its history, it managed the trick with considerable grace. That grace ran out in the late 19th century. Japan, remaking itself into a modern imperial state after the Meiji Restoration, looked at the Ryukyu Islands and saw a strategic and territorial asset it had no intention of leaving in ambiguity. In the 1870s, and then formally in 1879, Japan absorbed the Ryukyu Kingdom into its own administrative structure, renaming Okinawa as a Japanese prefecture, and beginning the long process of replacing Ryukyuan identity with Japanese identity. The local king was removed to Tokyo. The Ryukyuan language was suppressed in schools and public life. Japanese became the language of education, government, and advancement. Children who slipped into their native tongue at school were made to wear signs of shame around their necks, a practice remembered decades later by survivors with a particular bitterness that has never entirely faded. A kingdom was not conquered by armies, but by administration, and the result was a population caught in a condition that would prove catastrophically dangerous when the larger world came apart around them. By the early 20th century, Okinawans occupied an uncomfortable middle position in the Japanese imperial order. They were legally Japanese citizens, expected to serve in the Japanese military and pay Japanese taxes, yet they were regarded by many on the mainland as lesser, provincial, different. Their features, their dialect traces, their customs, all marked them as something other than fully Japanese in the eyes of those who would define such things. They were integrated enough to be conscripted, marginal enough to be looked down upon. When Japan went to war, Okinawan men served in the imperial armed forces and died in the same theaters as men from Tokyo and Osaka. The island's own civilians farmed their terraced fields, fished the coral waters, tended the graves of their ancestors in the rounded tomb structures scattered across the hillsides, and watched the war through the lens of an identity that belonged completely to neither of the powers about to fight over them. American strategic planners looking at the Pacific in the latter stages of the war saw Okinawa in entirely different terms. By the end of 1944, American forces had already clawed their way across an enormous arc of the Pacific: Guadalcanal, Tarawa, the Marshalls, Saipan, Guam, Leyte Gulf, Iwo and the brutal logic of each successive campaign was the same: get closer to Japan. The calculation in every planning room was ultimately about distance. Okinawa lay roughly 550 kilometers from the southernmost of Japan's main home islands. It had ample anchorage for a fleet, room to construct the kind of airfields that could base the full weight of American air power, and a geographic position from which an invasion of Kyushu, the southernmost of the home islands, could be mounted within operational range. No other available objective offered all of those qualities simultaneously. The debate in American command circles about whether to bypass Okinawa entirely was real and not brief. Some senior voices argued that the island could be neutralized by air and sea without the enormous cost of a ground campaign, that American forces could leap closer to Japan by other routes. But the arguments for Okinawa kept reasserting themselves. An invasion fleet of the scale required to assault the Japanese home islands would need a nearby harbor of extraordinary capacity to stage, refuel, repair, and resupply. The fleet anchorages around Okinawa could provide that. The island also lay within range of land-based fighter cover, which the Navy required given the scale of air opposition expected. When the debates finally concluded, the answer was always the same island. The planners working through the operational requirements for what would be designated Operation Iceberg assembled numbers that were staggering, even by the inflated standards of the Pacific War's later stages. More than 500,000 men would be directed toward a single objective: ground forces, naval crews, aviation personnel, support and logistics echelons that stretched back across the ocean in a chain of supply that took months to assemble and position. The naval force gathered to support the landings would be the largest assembled in the Pacific War's history, a fleet of such size that it altered the color and texture of the horizon wherever it gathered. This was not a raid, not an advance raid in force. This was the machinery of an entire industrial civilization being pointed at a narrow island and switched on. What those planners could calculate, the tonnages, the distances, the schedules, the aircraft assignments, were the mechanical dimensions of what was coming. What they could not fully calculate, or perhaps chose not to linger on, was that roughly 450,000 civilians lived on Okinawa and the surrounding smaller islands. These were not soldiers. They were farmers and fishermen, teachers and shopkeepers, elderly grandparents and small children. They had been told by Japanese authorities that the Americans who were coming intended to kill them, that surrender was dishonor, that death was preferable, that the enemy showed no mercy. Some of them believed this completely. Others were simply caught in circumstances they had no power to alter and no honest information to navigate. Civilians have always occupied the space between armies, but rarely has that space been as lethal as it would become in the southern districts of a small island in the spring of 1945. The two empires that were about to collide on Okinawa had reached this moment by different roads, but by the same logic. The logic that holds that a war, once begun, must be resolved, and that resolution requires the other side's submission or destruction. Japan had been fighting since the early 1930s in China, since 1941, against the United States, Britain, and their allies, and the weight of those years of war pressed down on its population, its military, and its leadership in ways that were beginning to produce decisions that could only be described as a civilization consuming itself. America had been building toward a final confrontation for nearly 4 years, and its planners saw in Okinawa not a destination, but a preparation. The last rung before the ladder disappeared, and a different kind of reckoning had to begin. The island between these forces was simply itself. It had been a kingdom once, absorbed by an empire, and now it sat in the path of a war it had not made. Its ancient stone tombs dotted the hillsides, Its farmers had planted sweet potatoes in terraced rows. Its children had been told what to fear and what to revere, in a language not entirely their ancestors' own. The coral reefs lay quiet in the clear water. The limestone caves ran through the southern hills in networks that would, very soon, determine the shape of an entire campaign. And somewhere across the Pacific, the greatest armada in the history of the ocean was already assembling, its destination plotted, its purpose fixed, its machinery grinding forward with the terrible momentum of a war that had to end somewhere. For reasons of geography and strategy, and the accumulated decisions of years, it was going to end here. By the winter of 1944 into 1945, the Pacific War had reached a point of terrible momentum. Island after island had been taken from Japan at enormous cost. Tarawa, Saipan, Peleliu, Leyte, and each one brought American forces closer to the same inescapable conclusion. The war in the Pacific could not be won without confronting Japan directly, on or near its own soil. The question that consumed the highest levels of Allied command was not whether to press forward, but exactly how, and through which door. What emerged from those deliberations would become one of the most complex and consequential military operations ever conceived, a campaign so vast in its ambition that it would stretch the limits of logistics, leadership, and human endurance alike. The planners called it Operation Iceberg. The name was cold, clinical, and in retrospect, quietly appropriate. Like an iceberg, the true scale of what it required was largely invisible until you were already far too close to turn back. The fundamental strategic logic was straightforward, even if the path to it was not. American planners had spent months examining the map of the Pacific, tracing the arc of advance that ran from the Southwest and Central Pacific upward toward the Japanese home islands. What they needed, above all else, was a large island within practical striking range of Kyushu, the southernmost of Japan's main islands, that could serve as an airbase, a fleet anchorage, a staging ground, and a supply depot all at once. It had to be close enough for land-based fighters to escort bombers over Japan. It had to have harbors capable of sheltering a fleet of unprecedented size. It had to have enough flat land for airfields and enough surrounding water for amphibious rehearsal. When those criteria were laid against a map, the island of Okinawa kept rising to the top. Roughly 560 kilometers from Kyushu, it was, in the language of the planners, the ideal final stepping stone. Yet the decision was not made without dissent. Some senior commanders argued seriously for bypassing Okinawa entirely, striking instead at Formosa, the large island now known as Taiwan, or moving directly against Kyushu with whatever could be assembled. General Douglas MacArthur, commanding Allied forces in the Southwest Pacific, had his own preferred axis of advance and his own sense of where resources should flow. Admiral Ernest King, the formidable chief of naval operations in Washington, had long favored Formosa as a more strategically ambitious objective. The debate played out in planning rooms and conference tables across Pearl Harbor, Washington, and the forward command posts of the Pacific Theater, heated, technically complex, and shadowed by the knowledge that whichever option was chosen, men would die in extraordinary numbers to execute it. What killed the Formosa option in the end was not ideology, but arithmetic. The forces required to seize and hold Formosa were simply beyond what could be assembled in the necessary time frame, and the island's interior was vast enough to swallow an army whole. Okinawa, for all its costs, was manageable. Formosa was not. Once the decision was made, planning proceeded with the kind of organized intensity that the American military machine had, by this late stage of the war, become extraordinarily good at generating. The operation would fall under the overall command of Admiral Raymond Spruance, leading the Fifth Fleet, with Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner commanding the Joint Expeditionary Force responsible for actually delivering men and equipment to the beaches. The ground forces would be organized into the newly formed 10th Army, commanded by Army General Simon Bolivar Buckner, Jr., a large and forceful Kentuckian, whose father had been a Confederate general, a fact that gave his name a certain historical resonance in the American South, though it meant little to the men preparing to fight under him in the Pacific. Buckner's 10th Army would combine 2 Marine Corps divisions and 2 Army Corps, a mixing of service cultures that would generate both tremendous fighting power and, at times, friction between commanders with very different tactical philosophies. The landing date became its own intricate calculation. The planners had to balance the Pacific's seasonal weather patterns, the spring rains that would begin to saturate Okinawa's terrain in May, against the logistical reality of how long it took to assemble and move a force of this scale. They also had to account for the ongoing operations elsewhere in the Pacific, particularly the assault on Iwo Jima, which had begun in February of 1945 and was consuming resources and attention at precisely the moment Iceberg demanded both. After working through the competing constraints, the date selected was the 1st of April 1945. The planners noted the date's coincidence with Easter Sunday and April Fool's Day, with the grim humor that tends to accumulate in military headquarters during long wars. Whether the date was auspicious or ironic, it was fixed. And from that point forward, every element of the operation began orienting itself toward that single morning on the western coast of Okinawa. The logistical scale of what was being assembled beggared ordinary comprehension. More than 500,000 American and Allied servicemen would be committed to the operation in its various phases, a number that exceeded the entire population of many American cities at the time. The naval force gathered to support them would become the largest armada ever assembled in the Pacific War, surpassing even the enormous fleets that had contested the Philippine Sea and Leyte Gulf. It included hundreds of warships ranging from battleships and fleet carriers down to destroyer escorts and landing craft, plus an almost incomprehensible number of support and supply vessels. Feeding, fueling, arming, and maintaining this force across thousands of kilometers of open ocean required a supply chain of staggering complexity, one that stretched back to ports in Hawaii, the Marianas, the Philippines, and ultimately to the industrial heartland of the continental United States itself. The troop ships that carried the assault divisions were floating cities of controlled discomfort. Men were packed into bunks, stacked 4 and 5 high in holds that smelled of unwashed bodies, diesel fuel, and the peculiar anxiety of men heading toward a fight they had been told would be harder than anything before. Veterans of earlier campaigns, men who had survived Guadalcanal, Cape Gloucester, Peleliu, carried the specific, educated dread of men who knew exactly what the waiting meant. Replacements fresh from training bases in the United States carried a different kind of fear, the fear of the unknown, sharpened by the stories the veterans told, sometimes deliberately and sometimes without meaning to. The days at sea blurred together. Weapons cleaning, card games, letters written and rewritten, the repetitive briefings from officers working through terrain models and beach charts, until the maps of a place none of them had ever seen became as familiar as the streets of home. Among the senior commanders, the weeks before the landing were consumed by the problem of the Japanese air threat. Intelligence had been accumulating about Japan's commitment to a new kind of aerial warfare, the organized use of suicide aircraft, the kamikazes, in coordinated mass attacks against the fleet. The threat had already proven devastating at Leyte Gulf and in subsequent Philippine operations, and the planners understood that at Okinawa, so close to the Japanese home islands, the attacks would be heavier than anything yet seen. The response was the establishment of a radar picket line, a ring of destroyers deployed far out from the main fleet to provide early warning and draw the first attacks away from the carriers and transports. It was a logical solution to a terrible problem, and the men assigned to those picket stations understood with uncomfortable clarity what it meant for them personally. They would be the first thing the kamikazes found. The preliminary phase of Operation Iceberg began before the main landings, with the seizure of the Karama Islands, a small cluster of islands roughly 30 kilometers west of Okinawa. The operation was intended to secure a sheltered anchorage where damaged ships could be repaired and resupplied without the long voyage back to rear area bases. American forces found the islands lightly defended but not uncontested, and among their most significant discoveries was a fleet of small wooden boats crammed into concealed coastal positions, hundreds of them, each loaded with explosives, intended to be piloted by Japanese sailors in suicide attacks against the invasion fleet. Their capture before the main landings removed a threat that might otherwise have produced catastrophic losses among the crowded anchorage. It was among the first signs of what the entire campaign would confirm, that the Japanese defense of Okinawa had been planned with an exhaustive, almost obsessive attention to the principle of inflicting cost. Every weapon, every position, every man on that island had been oriented toward a single purpose. The preliminary naval bombardment of Okinawa itself began in the days before the 1st of April, with battleships and cruisers working systematically along the coastline, while carrier aircraft struck airfields, supply depots, and any identified defensive position that could be reached from the air. By the standards of Pacific War bombardments, it was enormous, longer and heavier than almost any that had preceded it. And yet the men who planned it harbored a private understanding of its limitations against an enemy that had built its defenses deep underground, in rock-cut tunnels and natural cave systems that aerial bombs and naval shells simply could not reach. The bombardment was preparation, not solution. It could clear beaches and suppress surface positions. It could not touch what General Ushijima had built in the limestone hills of the south. That part of the battle would have to be fought by men on foot, in close, at enormous cost, and everyone in the planning rooms understood this, even if the full dimensions of what waited for them in the Shuri line were still beyond their knowledge. On the evening of the 31st of March, 1945, the Great Armada lay offshore in the darkness. More than 1,300 vessels stretched across the water, an accumulation of American industrial and military power, so vast it had no real precedent in the history of naval warfare. Aboard the troop ships, men ate their last hot meals, wrote their last letters, and tried to sleep against the noise of the ship's engines and the sound of their own thoughts. Some of them prayed. Some of them played cards until the light failed. Some simply lay on their bunks, staring at the steel ceiling above them, listening to the sea move beneath the hull. They had been told the landings might be lightly opposed. They had been told the beach was flat and the approaches were manageable. What they had not been told, what no briefing could fully convey, was what the island had been made into while they sailed toward it. That knowledge was waiting for them on the other side of the morning. There is a particular kind of soldier who understands, with cold clarity, that he cannot win, and chooses, instead, to make his enemy pay the highest possible price for the victory they will take from him. General Mitsuru Ushijima was that kind of soldier. Appointed to command the 32nd Army on Okinawa in the summer of 1944, he arrived on an island that Tokyo still regarded as a distant and secondary concern. Its defenses thin, its garrison modest, its strategic value not yet fully measured against the advancing tide of American power. Ushijima was a calm man by reputation, a former commandant of the military academy at Zama, polished in manner and precise in thought. But beneath the composure was a soldier who had studied what American amphibious doctrine had done to every island it had touched, Tarawa, Saipan, Peleliu, and who had drawn a conclusion his superiors in Tokyo were not yet ready to accept. The old way of fighting would not work here. The beaches would not be held. The Americans would land regardless of what waited for them at the waterline. The only real question was what happened afterward. Ushijima's chief of staff was a man of sharper temperament, Lieutenant General Isamu Cho, a figure known across the Imperial Army for his fierce ideology and aggressive instincts. Where Ushijima was measured, Cho was combustible. Where Ushijima counseled patience, Cho sometimes pressed for action. But the two men formed a working partnership, held together by a third figure, the Army's senior operations officer, Colonel Hiromichi Yahara, who was perhaps the most analytically gifted of the three. Yahara was the architect. He understood terrain the way an engineer understands stress and load, as a system that could be made to work for the defender or against the attacker, depending entirely on how the ground was read and used. It was Yahara, more than anyone, who translated Ushijima's strategic instinct into a concrete plan of fortification that would make the southern portion of Okinawa into something the American military had never quite encountered before. The plan they arrived at was a departure so radical it represented a near-complete repudiation of the doctrines that had governed Japanese island defense since the beginning of the Pacific War. Earlier commanders, from Guadalcanal to the Marianas, had placed their strength at the shore, expecting to destroy the enemy in the surf or on the sand, gambling on the disruption of an amphibious landing to even the odds. The Americans had learned to counter this. Naval gunfire, air support, and sheer mass of men and materiel had broken every beach defense the Japanese had constructed. Ushijima and Yahara looked at those failures not as anomalies, but as evidence of a systematic flaw in doctrine, a flaw they intended to correct by abandoning the beaches altogether. The Americans could have the shoreline. Let them land unopposed. Let them feel the absence of resistance. Let the silence on the beaches feel like a gift. The real battle would be waiting for them inland, in a belt of fortified ground running across the island's southern waste, anchored to the ancient fortress city of Shuri. Shuri was ideally situated for what Ushijima intended. Raised on a ridge commanding the surrounding terrain, the ancient castle at its heart had been the political and spiritual center of the Ryukyu kingdom for centuries. Its stone walls built by hands that understood permanence, the ridge itself, and the broken, cave-riddled limestone hills extending east and west from it, formed a natural defensive position of almost unreasonable strength. Yahara's engineers did not try to improve on this geography so much as they tried to complete it, to turn what nature had offered into something nearly impenetrable by any attacker who did not have weeks, months, and blood to spend. The work that followed was vast and largely invisible. From the surface, the hills of southern Okinawa looked much as they always had, steep, dense with vegetation, cut by ravines and outcroppings of pale stone. Beneath that surface, an entirely different architecture was being born. The cave systems that underpinned the Shuri line were not improvised shelters scratched out in the weeks before battle. They were deliberate, engineered structures, tunnels cut through limestone and coral, some of them running for hundreds of meters through the interior of ridges, connecting fighting positions on one slope to firing points on another, linking artillery chambers to ammunition stores, command posts to aid stations to escape routes. Working parties drilled and blasted and hauled rubble for months. The scale of the effort was staggering. Reverse slope positions, defensive works cut into the sides of hills facing away from the American advance, allowed Japanese defenders to shelter from naval gunfire and air attack, and then emerge to engage the moment American infantry crested a ridgeline and exposed themselves. An American unit taking the top of a hill would find it almost empty, only to be struck from three sides as defenders emerged from tunnels on the slopes below and the flanking ground to either side. The geometry of the position made every attack expensive and every advance temporary. Artillery was integrated into the defensive architecture with equal care. The Japanese brought to Okinawa a concentration of guns heavier than anything they had deployed on any previous Pacific island. Howitzers, mortars, heavy weapons of every caliber registered and mapped against the likely axes of American advance. These were not placed in the open where American air power could locate and destroy them. They were sited in caves or in positions cut into reverse slopes, their crews able to fire, withdraw under cover, and reappear at a different aperture. A weapon that cannot be seen, cannot easily be silenced. American gunners and airmen would spend weeks searching for batteries that moved and hid and moved again, extracting a toll and then disappearing back into the stone. The island's terrain, which looked from the air like nothing more dramatic than a series of modest ridges and green valleys, was in reality a series of interlocking killing grounds, each one designed to channel attackers into the fire of weapons they could not easily locate and could not safely ignore. Into this construction project, the Okinawan civilian population was drawn, not always willingly, and rarely with any real choice in the matter. The Imperial Japanese Army on Okinawa arrived with a complex and troubling relationship to the islanders it nominally protected. The Okinawans were Japanese subjects by law, but Ryukyuan in culture, speaking a language and practicing customs that the mainland army sometimes viewed with suspicion rather than solidarity. Despite this, or perhaps because of it, the military demanded their labor. Civilian men and women were conscripted into work details that dug tunnels, carried supplies, constructed fortifications, and maintained roads under conditions of increasing exhaustion and danger. Older boys were formed into student military units, assigned to carry messages, tend the wounded, and perform auxiliary tasks that placed them directly in the path of the fighting to come. Young women were organized into nursing auxiliaries. They were not soldiers, but the distinction would not protect them when the shells began to fall. The conscription extended beyond labor into something darker. Okinawan men were enrolled in home defense units given the most rudimentary of training and weaponry, bamboo spears in some accounts, surplus rifles in others, and assigned roles in the defensive scheme that amounted to being expendable bodies placed between the Japanese regulars and the advancing Americans. Some were genuinely motivated by loyalty to Japan, a nation whose language had been imposed in their schools and whose military culture had shaped an entire generation. Others complied because refusal was dangerous in an environment where Japanese military police and their collaborators treated signs of dissent as potential treachery. The line between mobilization and coercion was thin, and it disappeared entirely as the island was steadily transformed into a military zone where civilian life and military necessity became indistinguishable from one another. The Japanese command also made a deliberate choice to place key installations, headquarters, aid stations, ammunition depots, within or immediately beneath Okinawa's population centers and cave systems that civilians also used. This was partly a function of the terrain, which offered limited options, and partly a strategic calculation. Structures co-located with civilian habitation were harder for American commanders to engage without hesitation. It wove the civilian population into the defensive fabric of the island in a way that would make the coming battle catastrophic for ordinary Okinawans, regardless of which army they encountered. Those who understood what was coming tried to prepare. Most had no real conception of what modern industrial warfare looked like at close range. No frame of reference for what it meant to have two armies collide in the valley, where your family had farmed for generations. The doctrine guiding all of this preparation had a name, though the concept behind it was ancient. The defenders of Okinawa were not expected to win in any conventional sense. They were expected to bleed the Americans so severely, to kill so many men and sink so many ships, and consume so many weeks of calendar time, that the government in Washington would calculate that the invasion of the Japanese home islands was too costly to attempt. Every American soldier who died on Okinawa, every destroyer sent to the bottom, every landing ship consumed by fire, was a data point in an argument that Tokyo hoped to make to the American public and to American planners. Ushijima understood this with perfect clarity. He did not expect to hold the island forever. He expected to hold it long enough to matter, long enough that the number counted for something at a table where men were deciding how the war would end. By the late weeks of 1944 and the early months of 1945, the Shuri Line had taken on something close to its final form. Soldiers who walked those southern ridges in the winter before the battle would have seen, if they looked carefully, the narrow openings of fighting positions cut into limestone faces, the carefully camouflaged muzzles of weapons positioned to sweep every approach, the quiet movement of men and material through passages bored through the living rock beneath their feet. The island that American planners were studying on their maps, measuring beaches, calculating currents, projecting casualty rates, was not the island that actually existed. What existed was something that had been deliberately shaped into a trap, patient and deep and waiting. Ushijima had prepared his fortress. He had built it into the bones of the island itself, and now he waited for the Americans to arrive and walk into it. Somewhere in the vast middle of the Pacific Ocean, in the early weeks of 1945, the sea itself seemed to change. Ships appeared on the horizon, the way clouds gather before a storm. First one, then a dozen, then hundreds, until the water between islands and atolls and forward anchorages was crowded with steel in every direction a man could look. Transport vessels, attack transports, landing ship tanks, destroyers, cruisers, battleships, fleet carriers, hospital ships, ammunition ships, fuel oilers, repair tenders, a floating city that stretched across miles of open ocean. The men packed into the holds and berthing compartments of those ships knew, in the way soldiers always know before the orders are read aloud, that what they were sailing toward was unlike anything the Pacific War had yet produced. Veterans among them had seen Peleliu and Saipan and Leyte Gulf. New men had only heard stories. Neither group slept particularly well. The assembly of this armada had taken months of work across dozens of ports, anchorages, and staging bases scattered from Pearl Harbor to the Philippines to the Marianas. Logistics officers working in sweltering Quonset huts had coordinated the loading of ammunition by the tens of thousands of tons, rations calculated for weeks of combat, spare parts for vehicles that hadn't yet been destroyed, blood plasma, surgical equipment, barbed wire, bridging materials, and fuel enough to sustain an operation whose duration nobody could honestly predict. The men doing this work understood the scale of what they were building. They also understood, because the numbers demanded it, that planners expected those medical supplies to be used in full. More than 400 ships of the amphibious fleet alone would make the passage toward Okinawa. When the full naval force was counted, combat vessels, support ships, and auxiliaries together, the total ran past 1,500. No single naval operation in the Pacific had ever gathered this much seaborne power in one place. Life aboard the troop ships settled quickly into a rhythm that oscillated between tedium and dread. Bunks were stacked 4 and 5 high in compartments, designed for half the men now crammed into them. The smell below decks, sweat, fuel, the particular sourness of too many men in too little air, was something veterans accepted, and something new men never quite got used to. Card games ran continuously in whatever open space could be found. Some men read paperbacks until the pages fell apart. Others sharpened bayonets that were already sharp, or cleaned weapons that were already clean, because doing something with your hands was better than lying still and letting your mind wander. Chaplains held services in unlikely places, on hatch covers and vehicle decks, and the attendance was higher than peacetime congregations would ever have predicted. The officers held briefings, and those briefings contained the maps, and the maps showed Okinawa, 60 miles long, between 2 and 18 miles wide at various points, sitting roughly 350 miles from the Japanese home island of Kyushu. The men could read a map. They understood what 350 miles meant. They understood that Japan could reach this island with aircraft and with ships and with whatever else remained of a military that had already proven its willingness to spend human lives in ways that defied rational accounting. Some veterans, the ones who had fought through the Central Pacific island by island, did their arithmetic quietly. Okinawa was larger than any island they had taken. Its population was larger. Its garrison, as best as intelligence could estimate, was formidable. The briefings acknowledged all of this in careful language. The men translated the careful language back into plain terms among themselves, after the officers left. The fleet converged on the Ryukyu chain in stages rather than all at once, because an armada of this size cannot simply arrive. It has to be orchestrated, timed, sequenced, each component arriving in its proper order for the machine to function. Minesweepers went ahead. Underwater demolition teams, the frogmen, went ahead of that, swimming toward beaches in the darkness to check for obstacles and measure depth and note what the charts didn't show. It was dangerous, quiet work, and the men who did it with a professionalism that the historical record honors without needing to embellish. They found what they found, reported what they reported, and the planning proceeded on the basis of that hard intelligence. Before any Marine or soldier set foot on the main island, there was a preliminary objective that needed clearing. The Karama Islands, a cluster of small, rugged islands sitting roughly 15 miles to the southwest of Okinawa, had been identified as the place where the invasion fleet could establish a sheltered anchorage, a place where damaged ships could limp for repair, where supply vessels could offload without the exposure of open water. Seizing them required ground forces, and the operation to take them was assigned and launched in the days just before the main landings. It was the first blood of the campaign, and the men who fought there did so knowing that almost nobody beyond their own units was paying attention. The world's eyes were already fixed on the larger prize. The fighting for the Karama Islands was not simple, though it was brief by the standards of what came after. The defenders were not numerous, but they were determined, and the terrain of the islands, steep, rocky, honeycombed with the same kinds of natural and man-made cover that would define the entire Okinawa campaign, demanded careful, violent work to clear. American forces took casualties there, real ones. Men who would never know how the larger battle turned out. Among the discoveries on the islands was a fleet of small, high-speed boats, hundreds of them, each packed with explosives, built and staged for one purpose: to ram into the hulls of American ships. The cash was significant. It was catalogued, assessed, and destroyed. Its existence said something plainly about what Japan intended to bring to bear against the fleet that was even now gathering offshore. While the Kurama Islands were being secured, the preliminary naval bombardment of Okinawa had already begun. Battleships and cruisers moved to their firing positions and opened their main batteries on the beaches, the airfields, the defensive positions that aerial reconnaissance had identified. The thunder of those guns carried across the water continuously, day after day, a sound that sailors miles away learned to sleep through because the alternative was not sleeping at all. Carrier aircraft flew strike missions against the island's infrastructure, against radar installations, against anything that moved or could move. The bombardment by any ordinary standard was massive. American commanders wanted it to be more than massive. They wanted it to be complete, to strip the beaches of whatever resistance might be waiting. What they could not know was that the resistance wasn't waiting on the beaches at all. The men in the troop ships could hear the bombardment on the clearest days, a low rolling percussion that confirmed what they already knew, that the schedule was real, that the date was fixed, that the thing they had been sailing toward for days and weeks was now close enough to hear. Officers moved through the compartments with a particular kind of controlled calm that experienced enlisted men recognized and respected, the kind of calm that requires effort to maintain and is therefore worth more than the easy kind. Final equipment checks were conducted, unit assignments were confirmed, landing craft loading plans were reviewed one more time. The logistical machinery had been running for months, and now it was approaching the moment when it would no longer be logistics, but combat. The mood among the men defied simple description, because it was not one mood, but several existing simultaneously. There was fear, of course, the honest physical kind that men who have been in combat do not try to talk themselves out of, because they know better. There was also something like resolve, the product of training and unit identity, and the particular human refusal to let down the men standing next to you. Some men wrote letters home that they did not expect to send before the fighting started. Letters addressed to wives, to parents, to children who were learning to walk in houses their fathers hadn't seen in a year or more. Veterans who had made these approaches before occupied a different emotional register than the new men, quieter, more inward, neither hopeful nor despairing, but functional, each one having made whatever private accommodation allows a person to keep moving forward. The fleet was not simply a collection of ships and men. It was the physical expression of an industrial capacity that had been building toward this moment for 4 years. The product of shipyards that never stopped running, of factories that turned out vehicles and weapons and ammunition in quantities that would have seemed fictional in 1941, of a national effort that had reorganized itself around the single project of winning a war in 2 oceans simultaneously. The men who lived inside that fleet, crowded into its holds, standing watch on its bridges, maintaining its engines in the dark below the waterline, were not abstract participants in history. They were seasick and bored and frightened and cracking jokes and writing letters and playing cards and praying and thinking about home. They were, in the plainest sense, people. And they were sailing, in numbers that the Pacific had never held before, toward a small island at the edge of someone else's empire. On the last nights before the landings, the sea around Okinawa was so thick with American ships that veterans said it looked less like an ocean than like a harbor. Lights were blacked out. Voices were kept low. The guns continued their work on the shore, and somewhere in the dark interior of that island, behind ridgelines and inside tunnel systems that aerial bombardment could not reach, Japanese soldiers were listening to the same distant thunder that the men in the troop ships could feel in their chests. Both sides knew the morning was coming. Both sides, in their different ways, were ready. The morning of the 1st of April, 1945, arrived over the East China Sea with a clarity that seemed almost cruel in its beauty. The sky above Okinawa burned with the pale gold of early spring, and the water between the invasion fleet and the beaches of Hagushi lay flat and glittering, almost serene. Across more than 1,300 ships, men were already awake, had been awake for hours, some for the entire night, eating the kind of breakfast the Navy traditionally served before an amphibious assault, steak and eggs, a meal that felt less like generosity and more like a last rite. Marines and soldiers checked their weapons, adjusted their packs, looked at one another without saying very much. Every man who had fought before carried a specific dread in his chest. They had heard what the beaches of Tarawa looked like. They had heard about Peleliu. They had listened to the veterans talk, and the veterans never talked the way they had in the newsreels back home. The men lowered themselves into the landing craft with the grim efficiency of men who had accepted what was probably coming, and the boats churned toward the shore. It was Easter Sunday. It was also April Fool's Day. The coincidence was not lost on the men packed into those craft, and dark humor moved through the ranks, the way it always does when human beings have nothing left to control but their own wit. Someone noted that the two occasions seemed entirely appropriate for what they were being asked to do: rise from the sea, trust in something beyond reason, and expect to be punished for their hope. The assault waves were organized with the practiced precision of a campaign that had been planned for months, rehearsed across distant atolls, and refined by staff officers who had studied every aerial photograph of this coastline with something close to obsession. The Hagushi beaches on the western coast of Okinawa were wide, relatively accessible, and within striking distance of the two airfields the Americans needed most: Yontan in the north, Kadena in the south. Seize those fields on the first day, and the logic of the entire operation would snap into place. Everything after that was supposed to be the hard part. The ramps dropped at roughly 9 o'clock in the morning. Across a beachfront stretching nearly 9 kilometers, the first waves of American troops splashed ashore and ran, and found almost nothing waiting for them. A handful of rifle shots cracked from the tree line. A few mortars fell, their explosions swallowed by the width of the beach and the disbelief of the men who had braced for something unimaginably worse. There were no machine gun nests raking the waterline. There were no massed defenders behind the seawall. There was no curtain of fire dropping across the landing zone as the boats came in. Veterans who had trained their minds to expect the worst stood in the open on a beach in Okinawa and looked at one another with an expression that was not quite relief and not quite confusion, something in between that had no real name. One soldier, later quoted in regimental histories, reportedly said it felt like being handed a loaded pistol and told the target had simply decided not to show up. The quiet, on a morning when noise had seemed certain, was almost unbearable. Within the first hour, the scale of this absence became undeniable. Troops were moving inland faster than any pre-invasion schedule had projected. Units that had planned for hours of beach fighting to secure their objectives were instead jogging through open ground, through villages that stood empty and undisturbed, past gardens where the spring crops were already beginning to come up in the terraced fields. The civilians of Okinawa had largely fled ahead of the landings, driven by Japanese military orders and by weeks of terrifying American bombardment. The physical island, its red soil, its low hills, its ancient banyan trees, remained intact in these northern landing zones, in a way that almost no one had expected. Commanders aboard the command ships, monitoring the situation reports streaming in, kept waiting for the counterattack. for the message that the beach had collapsed into chaos. It did not come. The second and third waves landed behind the first, and they too moved inland, almost without opposition. Yontan airfield fell before midday. The Marines who took it found Japanese aircraft still parked on the field, tools scattered beside them, as though the mechanics had simply stood up and walked away mid-task. The speed of the seizure was bewildering. This was an objective that planners had estimated might take days of fighting, and instead, it was secured within hours of the initial landing, almost without a shot. Kadena Airfield, assigned to army units pushing south from the beaches, fell with equal speed and equal disbelief. By the time the afternoon sun had crossed its peak, American forces controlled both airfields that the entire campaign had been designed to capture on the first day, and the beachhead that military planners had hoped, but not expected, to hold by nightfall, already stretched kilometers deep into the island's interior. Logisticians who had built their supply timelines around expected casualties and contested ground found those timelines rendered almost meaningless by the pace of the advance. The mood among the men was electric and uneasy in equal measure. Those who had not fought before, and there were many, because this army contained entire divisions that had spent their war in training camps, experienced something close to euphoria, a giddiness that perhaps this war was not as advertised, that perhaps the stories had been exaggerated. The veterans understood something different. They knew that the Japanese did not make mistakes of this magnitude by accident. They had seen what Japanese soldiers were capable of when they chose to fight. They had buried friends on beaches where the defense had been total and merciless. The fact that the defense here was essentially absent was not reassurance. It was a question. It was a question with an answer somewhere further down the island, somewhere to the south, somewhere they hadn't reached yet, and the veterans found themselves looking in that direction with a particular kind of attention, not the attention of men expecting relief, but of men waiting for the other hand to move. By the end of the first day, more than 60,000 American troops were ashore. The number was staggering, a force larger than the entire garrison of some of the islands the Americans had previously fought and bled to take. Deposited on Okinawa in a single day at a cost that was, by the standards of this war, almost incomprehensible in its lightness. Total American ground casualties on that first day numbered less than 200, a figure so far below the projected estimates that it bordered on statistical impossibility given the forces involved. Senior officers tried to calibrate their reactions, tried to resist the temptation to believe that the battle had somehow already been won, that Japan had lost its nerve. The weight of previous experience argued against such optimism, and it argued loudly, but the numbers were the numbers. And on the evening of the 1st of April 1945, the numbers said that the Americans had achieved in hours what they had budgeted weeks to accomplish. What the Americans did not fully appreciate in those first exhilarating hours of movement was the architecture of the decision that had produced this silence. General Ushijima and his staff had looked at the beaches of Hagushi and made a cold, deliberate calculation. Defending the beaches meant absorbing the full weight of American naval gunfire, the kind of fire that had reduced the fortifications of other islands to rubble before a single boot touched the sand. It meant sacrificing the 32nd Army in a matter of days against a bombardment no human being could survive in fixed positions. Ushijima had watched what American firepower had done to Japanese beach defenses elsewhere, and he had refused to repeat the lesson. He had pulled his forces south, into the ridgelines and hills and cave systems that his engineers had been building and expanding for months, and he had waited. Every American soldier who jogged inland on the 1st of April was walking, step by willing step, toward the ground that Ushijima had chosen for the killing. The seizure of Yontan and Kadena fields brought American engineers and aviation units ashore almost immediately, and within days, the first American aircraft would be operating from Okinawan soil, a profound shift in the strategic situation, placing Allied air power within short range of the Japanese home islands. The logistical machinery that followed the assault troops ashore was itself a kind of spectacle. Bulldozers, ammunition carriers, medical units, water purification equipment, engineer battalions, the industrial sinews of modern warfare arriving on a captured coastline with practiced efficiency. The beach operations teams worked with the controlled urgency of men who understood that the window of easy movement would not stay open indefinitely. They were right. To the south, the terrain was already beginning to change, the open ground giving way to the corrugated limestone ridges and terraced hills that Ushijima's army was even now settling into, checking fields of fire, stocking ammunition in deep stone chambers, waiting. The Marines driving north encountered resistance that, while sparse in those first days, gave a sharper edge to the general mood of cautious optimism. Scattered Japanese units, left behind to harass rather than halt the advance, used the jungle-covered ravines and hillsides of the Motobu Peninsula to make short, vicious firefights from positions that were nearly invisible until the moment they opened fire. These skirmishes were reminders, small ones, but clear ones, of what the Japanese soldier looked like when he had chosen ground and chosen to fight. The northern terrain was difficult, the vegetation thick, the heat beginning to build as April settled in. Supply lines stretched as units moved faster than logistics could comfortably follow, but the fighting in the north, though real, was sideshow compared to what was gathering in the south. And the men who pushed along those jungle trails sensed it, even if they could not yet know its shape or measure its depth. In the days that followed the landing, as American forces consolidated their beachhead and began to probe southward, the initial quiet began to find its explanation in blood. The first serious contacts with Japanese defensive positions came in the rolling hills below the central island, and they came with a sudden, jarring violence that stopped the advance as cleanly as a wall. Men who had been walking upright were suddenly crawling. Men who had been pressing forward were suddenly counting their dead. The Japanese had not run. They had not panicked. They had repositioned with deliberate skill into terrain that gave them every advantage, and they were waiting behind meters of limestone and earth for an army that was just now beginning to understand the nature of the campaign it had entered. The eerie, sunlit quiet of that first morning on the beaches of Hagushi had not been the absence of a battle. It had been the opening move of one, a move of such calculated patience that it would take weeks of American lives to fully read its meaning. The 1st of April 1945 would be remembered by the men who landed as the strangest day of the war. The day when everything went right, and every veteran knew, with absolute certainty, that this was the worst possible sign. The morning after Love Day, Okinawa felt almost generous. Troops who had steeled themselves for a slaughter on the beaches found themselves moving inland through terraced fields and quiet villages, their rifles shouldered, their eyes scanning for a threat that simply refused to materialize. The silence was not peace. Every veteran present understood that. It was an invitation, a carefully constructed absence, and it pulled the American advance forward in two directions at once. To the south, the army would eventually meet the wall that Ushijima had built for them. But first, the island had to be cut in half, consolidated, mapped, and held. The Marines turned north. What waited for them up there was not the same kind of war they would eventually find below Shuri. It was older, wilder, and in its own way, just as merciless. The jungle did not care about doctrine. and neither did the men defending it. The 1st Marine Division and the 6th Marine Division divided the labor of the island between them with the methodical confidence of men who had bled their way across Peleliu and Guadalcanal and Cape Gloucester. The 6th pushed north along the western coastal road, while the 1st secured the central ground and handed the southern axis to the Army's 24th Corps. The northern drive looked straightforward on a map, and maps, as every Pacific veteran had learned, were documents of optimism. The road network was thin, the bridges were suspect, and the terrain changed character with every ridge climbed. Flat cane fields gave way to pine forest. Pine forest gave way to limestone karst. The karst gave way to something that felt prehistoric, a tangle of razor-edged rock, dense subtropical growth, and elevation changes sharp enough to leave a man breathless before a single shot had been fired. For the first several days, the Marines moved faster than anyone in planning had dared to hope. Villages were secured, crossroads occupied, hilltops marked on maps, and left to service troops moving up behind the infantry. The Okinawan civilians, encountered in the north, were mostly frightened and exhausted, emerging from hiding with their hands raised, uncertain whether the propaganda they had been fed about American soldiers would prove true. Civil affairs units moved with the advance, collecting the displaced and setting them behind the lines in holding areas that would eventually grow into something resembling organized camps. But the speed of the advance was already masking a developing problem. Supply convoys had to cover increasingly long distances over roads that deteriorated by the day. Ammunition and rations arrived, but not always where they were needed, and not always when. The further north the rifle companies went, the thinner the tether connecting them to everything they required. It was the Motobu Peninsula that changed the character of the northern campaign entirely. Jutting westward from the island's narrowing midsection, like a clenched fist, Motobu was geologically unlike anything the Marines had yet crossed. Its interior was dominated by a mass of interconnected peaks, and at the heart of those peaks stood Mount Yatake, not a single summit, but a ridgeline complex of broken ground, forested ravines, and sheer limestone faces that offered a defender almost limitless opportunity and an attacker almost none. A Japanese naval ground force, under a capable and determined commander, had withdrawn into this terrain weeks before the landings and had spent that time preparing it. They had no intention of dying quickly. The approach to Motobu was itself a lesson in how quickly a landscape could become hostile. Marine columns pushing onto the peninsula's road network found the going increasingly difficult as the ground rose and the trees closed in. Patrols that pushed off the roads encountered fire from positions that seemed to appear from the hillside itself, concealed firing slits, natural rock formations improved by hand, and a system of trails invisible from any aerial photograph. The enemy force was not large by the standards of what was happening in the south, but it was well placed, well supplied with ammunition, and fighting on ground it had chosen and prepared. A smaller force holding better terrain can exhaust a larger one, and the Japanese in the Motobu Hills understood this completely. The assault on Mount Yatake unfolded over several days of grinding, disorienting close-quarters fighting that stripped away the neat vocabulary of military operations and replaced it with something rawer. Companies assigned to take a particular ridgeline would fight their way to the crest, only to find the position dominated by fire from an adjacent height they hadn't known was occupied. Support weapons that worked beautifully on open ground were nearly useless in forested ravines, where a mortar round might detonate in the tree canopy 30 feet overhead or roll harmlessly down a slope. Flamethrowers and demolition charges became the tools of choice. Close, intimate, and terrible. Communication between units was broken repeatedly by terrain that defeated radio signals, forcing runners to carry messages through ground that was being actively contested. Men took casualties going back and forth with information that would have been obsolete before they delivered it. Artillery support was difficult and sometimes impossible to coordinate in the close-in fighting on Yayatake's slopes. The proximity of friendly forces to Japanese positions meant that the fire missions, which could have broken resistance from a distance, had to be walked in with extreme caution, and even then, the ravines swallowed shells unpredictably. Naval gunfire, which had been devastating on the open beaches, could reach the peninsula's outer edges, but not its broken interior. The Marines who went up those slopes went without the reliable fire support umbrella that American forces had come to depend on, and they felt its absence acutely. What they had instead was each other, and the particular kind of close combat experience that comes from having been through worse, or believing, in the moment, that you had. There were acts of extraordinary individual courage on those hillsides that were witnessed only by the men alongside whom they occurred, never to be written into any formal record. Junior officers and sergeants made decisions that saved their units or failed them based on information that would fit on a cigarette paper. Ammunition conservation became a constant preoccupation. A rifle squad that burned through its loads in a sustained firefight faced a wait for resupply that could be measured in hours rather than minutes. Water was scarce in the high ground, and men learned quickly which rock faces sweated moisture in the morning air and which did not. The peninsula was not a campaign within a campaign. It was a sustained emergency that lasted long enough to become routine. The fall of Mount Yatake, when it came, was not the clean seizure of a summit. It was the gradual exhaustion of a defense that had no means of resupply or reinforcement, worn down by Marines who kept coming, regardless of what it cost them. Japanese survivors of the main positions on Yaitake dispersed into the surrounding jungle and continued to fight in small groups for days afterward, requiring sweeping and clearing operations that produced casualties long after the commanding ground had officially changed hands. This was a pattern that would repeat throughout the Northern Campaign, the formal declaration of an objective secured, followed by the grinding work of dealing with what remained behind. Okinawa's terrain had a way of holding on to its defenders, even after they had been defeated. While the Marines fought for Motobu, the army's advance through the central and northern sections of the island had proceeded at a pace that surprised even its own commanders. Resistance in the north above the Shuri corridor was genuinely light. Ushijima had made the deliberate calculation that the north was strategically irrelevant and had concentrated his strength below. American soldiers moved through towns and fishing villages that had been emptied by fear rather than fire, across terrain that was difficult but not defended, and planted their flags on northern capes overlooking an empty sea within days of the landing. By the standards of every previous Pacific Island assault, the speed was extraordinary. It generated a mood of momentum, a sense that Okinawa might be resolved more cleanly and quickly than the worst predictions had allowed. That mood would not survive contact with the South. The officers who had studied the intelligence reports understood, even as the northern flags went up, that the real campaign had not yet begun. The lines drawn in pencil on planning maps showing the Shuri defensive belt were not abstractions. They represented months of Japanese labor, thousands of tons of excavated rock, and an intention to kill Americans at a rate that would make every previous Pacific battle feel like preparation. The ease of the North was not a dividend from which the campaign could draw. It was a postponement. Every kilometer covered in the jungle of Motobu, every hour spent clearing Yaitake's ravines, was time the Japanese in the south spent waiting in their caves, with their weapons cleaned and their fields of fire calculated to the meter. The northern campaign closed the top of the island and secured the flanks, but it also consumed weeks and cost men and materiel that could not be replaced instantly. Marine units that had been tested hard in the Motobu fighting rotated out for rest and resupply, absorbing replacements who had never been in combat and trying to pass on in days the accumulated knowledge that only comes from having been shot at in that specific kind of terrain. When the 6th Marine Division eventually turned south to join the battle at the Shuri line, it carried the experience of Yatake with it, the habits of caution, the respect for concealed positions, the instinct to never assume that a hill, which appears quiet, is actually empty. They would need every lesson the North had taught them. The South was going to be an education of an entirely different order. In the first days of April, the American advance northward and eastward across Okinawa had moved with such speed that commanders began to wonder if the Japanese had somehow abdicated the island entirely. The airfields fell, the central plateau opened, supply dumps grew, prisoners trickled in, mostly conscripted Okinawan laborers and scattered stragglers who seemed to have no orders and no will to fight. The optimism was palpable. Some officers began to whisper that the campaign might be over by mid-May, perhaps sooner. This confidence, however, was the product of catastrophic misreading. The Japanese had not abandoned Okinawa. They had merely withdrawn from it, deliberately ceding the flat northern and central terrain to compress their forces around the terrain that mattered most, the rugged, defensible south, where the ancient kingdom of the Ryukyus had built its greatest castle at Shuri, and where the island's broken geography became an ally to the defenders and a grinding curse to the attackers. The Shuri line was not a thin ribbon of fortifications, but a vast network of positions, stretching roughly 6 miles across the widest part of the southern Okinawa interior, anchored on the east, near the port town of Naha, and extending westward through a series of ridges and draws that twisted through the landscape in ways no map could adequately convey. The line was not even primarily above ground. General Mitsuru Ushijima and his chief of staff, Colonel Hiromichi Yahara, had spent months directing the construction of an almost invisible defensive system. Intricate networks of caves, shelters, and firing positions dug deep into the limestone bedrock, connected by tunnels so extensive that entire battalions could move underground without exposure. The caves were not crude holes, but engineered fortresses, with ventilation shafts, ammunition magazines, command posts, and hospitals carved into the rock itself. Artillery pieces were emplaced in reverse slope positions, where they could fire over the crests of ridges without being visible to American spotters and counter-battery fire. The Japanese had learned this doctrine the hard way across 3 years of losing island after island to American assault. Each successive island had taught them that defending the beaches was suicide, that the only hope for inflicting unacceptable casualties was to give ground, compress the defense, and funnel the American advance into ground that would work for the defender. The terrain itself became an almost animate presence in the coming battles. Kakazu Ridge, the first major obstacle the American 10th Army encountered as it moved south from the secured Central Plateau, was not a clean military feature, but a convoluted spine of limestone running roughly east to west, with high ground, draws, and ravines interlocking in a pattern that made mutual support nearly impossible for attacking troops and nearly perfect for defenders ensconced in caves. The approaches were dominated by a succession of lesser features. Cactus Ridge, which jutted northward as an outpost of the main line, and a chaotic landscape of eroded hills and sunken roads that seemed designed by nature to punish any infantry trying to move across it. The soil was thin in places, non-existent in others, exposing the white limestone beneath in a way that made concealment almost impossible for attacking forces. Every ravine led to a dead end or a killing ground. Every ridge seemed to have another ridge behind it, and behind that, another. The island was literally eating the landscape of conventional warfare and demanding that the Americans adapt or die trying. The American 10th Army commander, General Simon Bolivar Buckner, inherited a campaign that had seemed to be proceeding according to plan, with his ground forces organized into two corps. The Marine 3rd Corps, under General Roy Geiger, on the left or western flank, and the Army 24th Corps, under General John Hodge, on the right or eastern flank. Both commanders had combat experience, but neither fully grasped the implications of the terrain into which they were now pushing. On the 4th of April, just 3 days after Love Day, Hodge's 24th Corps made its first real contact with organized Japanese positions near Kakazu. The initial assaults were made by the 96th Infantry Division, soldiers who had seen combat in the Pacific, but not anything quite like this. The ridge itself seemed modest, not dramatically high, certainly not mountainous. But the moment American infantrymen began climbing, they discovered that Kakazu was less a mountain than a medieval fortress. Japanese defenders dug into caves and reverse slope positions, waited until the Americans were silhouetted against the sky, then opened fire with devastating accuracy. The first assaults were repulsed with heavy losses. The second assaults were repulsed harder. What unfolded over the next 2 weeks was not a battle in any conventional sense, but the collision between two fundamentally incompatible approaches to warfare. The Americans, trained and equipped to move fast, to use firepower to replace manpower, to overwhelm the enemy through mobility and superior resources, found themselves in terrain where none of those advantages applied. The caves that honeycombed Kakazu and the surrounding ridges could not be destroyed by artillery or air power without first being located, and they were deliberately constructed to be unlocatable until the moment they opened fire. A cave mouth could be 20 feet across, or 2 feet across, concealed in shadow or in the jumbled rocks of a slope, invisible until the moment a defender chose to reveal it. American artillery, the great hammer of the American way of war, could pound Kakazu for hours and seemingly accomplish nothing except to churn the limestone surface into pale dust. Tanks, the other great symbol of American mechanized power, could climb the approaches only slowly and could be ambushed by Japanese soldiers with mines and anti-tank guns deployed in positions chosen with meticulous care. The infantry, finally, was left with the most primitive tool of warfare, the rifle and the hand grenade, and the human body climbing a slope toward an enemy that could see them but could not be seen in return. By the 8th of April, the 96th Infantry Division had made repeated assaults on Kakazu and had been repulsed each time, not by anything resembling a concentrated counterattack, but by the simple mathematics of a defender in prepared positions with a clear field of fire. The division's commander, Major General James Bradley, ordered assault after assault with the grim determination of a man running out of options and running out of time. Men who had survived the fighting in the Philippines and elsewhere in the Pacific began to understand that they had entered a different kind of war, one that would not be decided by courage or firepower or tactical mobility, but by pure attritional butchery. The casualty reports that filtered back northward to Buckner's headquarters told a story that conflicted sharply with the optimistic projections that had circulated just days earlier. American casualties were mounting. Japanese resistance was not cracking. The terrain was not yielding to assault. The Japanese artillery, positioned in caves and reverse slope positions deeper in the island, could rain fire down on attacking American positions with apparent impunity. The western flank, held by the Marine Third Corps, encountered similar obstacles almost immediately. The Marines' zone included what would become known as the Cactus Ridge Complex, and as they pushed south and west in the first days of April, they began to run into organized Japanese positions that seemed to deepen the further south they advanced. The Marines, accustomed to rapid movement and aggressive tactics, found themselves grinding against positions that would not yield to pressure. Cactus Ridge itself, though smaller than Kakazu, had the same fundamental property: a defender's position dug into limestone, with multiple caves and firing positions that created a killing zone for anything trying to cross open ground. The Marines attacked it multiple times in the first 2 weeks of April and were forced back each time. The casualties were mounting across both corps. The casualty rates in the assault divisions began to look more like the Normandy campaign or the Philippines than like the rapid amphibious operations that the American command had trained for and expected. What the American commanders were only slowly beginning to understand was that they were not simply facing enemy soldiers in prepared positions, but rather an entire defensive system whose architecture and ingenuity had been shaped by the Japanese doctrine that had emerged from the hard lessons of the previous island campaigns. Ushijima and Yahara had taken what they had learned on Peleliu and other islands where American forces had ultimately overwhelmed Japanese positions through sheer weight of firepower and numbers, and had pushed that doctrine to its extreme. The Shuri Line was not a single ridge, but a series of defensive belts stretching for miles, with each ridge or draw being mutually supporting with others, so that taking any single position required taking all the positions around it simultaneously. The Japanese had been explicit in their planning that American artillery and air power would be superior and would inevitably do significant damage, so the defense was built on the assumption that artillery would pound continuously, but would not prevent determined soldiers from fighting. The caves were positioned to survive any foreseeable level of bombardment. The supply lines ran underground where possible. The command and control system was distributed across multiple cave complexes so that the destruction of any one location would not collapse the entire defense. The American command structure, meanwhile, was beginning to wrestle with the reality that the campaign was going to take far longer than the optimistic projections of early April. Buckner and his corps commanders had assumed that the Japanese would make a stand at some point and then collapse once American firepower and weight of numbers were brought to bear. But Ushijima had anticipated this assumption and had built a defense that would not collapse, that would instead slowly absorb casualties and extract payment in American blood for every inch of terrain surrendered. The American commanders, trained in a doctrine that emphasized rapid movement and exploitation of breakthroughs, found themselves forced to commit to a grinding attritional struggle. This was not what they wanted, and not what they had been trained for, but it was what the terrain and the Japanese defense were demanding. By mid-April, the pattern had become distressingly clear. The initial assault against Kakazu and Cactus Ridge had not broken the Japanese line. The expected collapse had not materialized. Instead, what was emerging was that the Shuri Line would have to be broken through a series of deliberate assaults, each one carefully orchestrated and paid for in casualties. American artillery would provide support, but the final assault would have to be made by infantry moving through a landscape that was fundamentally hostile to large-scale maneuver. Tanks could provide some support, but the terrain limited their effectiveness. Air power, so dominant in other theaters, could not directly strike positions dug into caves and reverse slopes. The American command was beginning to understand that what they faced was not a line that could be bypassed or outflanked or broken through with a single decisive blow, but rather a multi-layered defensive system whose depth extended from Kamikaze southward for miles, anchored on the western end at Sugarloaf Hill, and other features that intelligence was only beginning to catalogue. The human cost of this discovery was being paid every day in the casualty reports, in the replacement drafts that were called for, in the way that divisions that had been at nearly full strength at Loveday were being quietly reorganized into smaller, more compact units, because there were simply fewer men to fight. The wounded were being evacuated by the thousands, and the killed were being buried in temporary cemeteries. The Marines and soldiers of the 10th Army were learning that defeating the Japanese would not be accomplished through surprise or deception, or through the successful exploitation of mobility, but rather through a disciplined, methodical process of reducing a series of mutually supporting positions through direct assault, using firepower to prepare the assault and courage to execute it. The Shuri Line had been revealed not as a single obstacle, but as an entire theatre of war unto itself, and the campaign that had seemed on the 4th of April to be moving towards swift conclusion was becoming the longest, bloodiest, and most attritional battle of the American war against Japan in the Pacific. The implications of this shift would reshape not just the tactical situation on Okinawa, but the strategic calculations that American planners were beginning to contemplate regarding the invasion of Japan itself. If the 32nd Army could inflict these kinds of casualties in defense of a remote island, what would be the cost of invading the Japanese home islands, where the defense would be organized by the entire Japanese military, and where the population itself would be mobilized for defense? The question hung unspoken over the headquarters staffs, but it was beginning to shape contingency planning in a way that the casualty figures from Kamikaze and Cactus Ridge could not be ignored. For now, though, the campaign on Okinawa would continue, as it had been forced to continue. Assault after assault, ridge after ridge, with the Japanese defenders extracting payment in American casualties for every meter of terrain, and the American command learning hard lessons about the limits of firepower and the persistence of a determined defense. In the waters surrounding Okinawa, a different battle was unfolding. While American soldiers and Marines fought through mud and caves in the island's interior, the Navy faced an enemy that came from the sky, with a fury the Pacific War had not yet witnessed. Japan's military planners, watching the invasion fleet materialize offshore, understood they could not stop the landing through conventional means. Their air force was shattered, their ships mostly sunk or hidden in ports far away. What remained was a weapon born from desperation and ideology, the kamikaze, the divine wind. Between the 1st of April and the 22nd of June, Japan would launch 10 massive coordinated aerial offensives, collectively known as Kikusui, Operation Floating Chrysanthemum. These were not ragtag suicide attacks by individual pilots. They were organized, numbered, planned assaults involving hundreds of aircraft, coordinated with precision across multiple airfields, meant to inflict such catastrophic losses on the American fleet that the invasion would collapse under its own casualties. The men who planned this campaign did not believe it would fail. They believed it would force America to negotiate, to accept a peace that left Japan something other than complete surrender. What they were actually launching was the most sustained and coordinated suicide offensive in human warfare. The waters off Okinawa would become the killing ground for sailors who had nowhere to hide and nowhere to retreat. The radar picket destroyers were the first and most brutal target. These were smaller warships stationed far out to sea in a defensive perimeter around the main fleet, their job to detect incoming aircraft and radio warnings back to the combat air patrol overhead. The Americans had learned through harsh experience that they needed these early warning stations, that without them, the kamikazes would slice through the fleet unpredictably. But the cost of this protection was terrible. The radar picket destroyers were isolated, almost defenseless against a coordinated air attack, and every Japanese pilot with a bomb and a full tank of fuel knew exactly where to find them. The first major Kikasui attack came on the 6th of April, when waves of aircraft descended on the picket line. Destroyer after destroyer found itself surrounded, its anti-aircraft guns firing frantically at approaching aircraft, the crews knowing that every aircraft that reached the ship was a death sentence. The USS Emmons went down that day, struck by multiple kamikazes in rapid succession, her crew scattered across burning decks, some jumping into the sea to escape the flames, others going down with the ship. It was a foretaste of what was coming. Between April and June, the radar picket line would absorb the worst the Japanese could deliver. 14 destroyers and smaller craft would be sunk. Nearly 100 more would be damaged. The casualty rate among officers and men aboard these vessels exceeded that of any other assignment in the entire Pacific campaign. The destroyers developed their own tactics for survival, improvised and refined through bitter experience. When kamikazes were spotted coming in, the standard procedure was to maneuver violently, turn hard to port or starboard, increase speed to maximum, anything to avoid becoming a stable target. The anti-aircraft gunners became phenomenally skilled through desperate repetition. They learned to track incoming aircraft, to lead them like hunters leading ducks, to gauge the angle and distance, and squeeze off bursts at the precise moment. Some ships formed tight formations to provide mutual fire support, creating walls of anti-aircraft fire that an incoming pilot had to fly through. But even the best tactics offered no guarantee. A determined pilot on a suicide run, committed to dying anyway, could press through any wall of fire if he was willing to absorb damage and keep coming. The psychological effect on the crews was immense. Unlike the men on land, who could at least entrench themselves or move, the sailors on these picket destroyers knew they were bait. They knew they were positioned to be hit. They knew that their sole job was to warn the rest of the fleet, which meant absorbing attacks themselves. The men who served on the radar pickets understood their sacrifice, perhaps more consciously than any others in the campaign. They wrote letters home, knowing they might not survive the week. Some kept journals chronicling their daily certainty of death. Others simply accepted what was coming, with the stoicism that sailors developed as a coping mechanism. The kamikaze attacks followed a pattern that became grimly predictable. The Japanese would attack in waves, sometimes coordinated with surface craft or submarines below, sometimes with high-altitude bombers dropping conventional ordnance, while fighters came in low to crash into ships' superstructures. The attacks would come in the early morning, at dusk, or at night, when American fighter cover was thinnest. The pilots themselves were a mixture of seasoned veterans and teenage recruits, trained in weeks rather than months. All of them understood the mission was one way. This was not a tactic in which pilots hoped to damage the enemy and return. This was a strategy in which the aircraft itself, loaded with explosives, became the weapon. The human cost to Japan was staggering. The Japanese committed more than 1,800 sorties to the Kikasui campaign. 1,800 pilots, most of them young men, who had no choice in the matter, and who flew knowing they would not return. Some were volunteers, yes, but many were conscripted, given the choice between the honor of suicide for the emperor or the shame of refusal. The Japanese military, facing defeat they could not prevent, had chosen to spend human life at a rate that staggers comprehension. The kamikaze pilots who survived long enough to reach their targets did inflict devastating damage. An aircraft piloted into the flight deck of a carrier or the hull of a destroyer could create fires that spread through the ship with terrifying speed. The explosions damaged engines, destroyed compartments, killed men instantly, or trapped them below decks, where they burned or drowned as the ship went down. The psychological impact on American sailors was profound. Many had served through years of conventional air attacks, but this was different. This was an enemy that actively wanted to die, that saw its own destruction as victory, that had stripped from warfare the possibility of survival through skill or luck. Aboard the larger fleet, the impact of the Kamikaze campaign was chaotic and overwhelming. The escort carriers, small, lightly armored flat tops that had been converted from cargo ships, were particularly vulnerable. When a kamikaze hit the flight deck of a carrier, the results were catastrophic. The pilots and mechanics working on the deck were slaughtered. Aircraft loaded with fuel and ammunition exploded. Fires spread through the cramped confines of the ship with nothing to stop them. The USS Bunker Hill, a fleet carrier and one of the most powerful ships in the Pacific, was hit by 2 kamikazes on the 11th of May, while carrying a full complement of aircraft. The explosions and resulting fires killed more than 600 men in minutes. The ship was so badly damaged, she had to leave the operational area for weeks. Similar scenes played out on dozen other vessels. The USS Wake Island, an escort carrier, went down after a kamikaze strike. The USS Little, a destroyer, was sunk. The USS Aaron Ward was hit 5 times by kamikazes on the 3rd of May and somehow remained afloat, a testimony to American damage control procedures, but also a mark of how many times the crew had to fight for the ship's survival. The accumulation of damage across the fleet was immense. By the end of May, so many ships had been damaged or sunk that the American admirals were running short of vessels to replace the losses. The human stories aboard the damaged ships formed a separate drama from the battle raging on the island. A sailor who survived a kamikaze strike faced not just the immediate terror of the attack, but the aftermath of explosion, fire, and flooding. If he was lucky, he was on a part of the ship that didn't catch fire. He helped with damage control, fought the flames, pulled injured shipmates to safety. If he was unlucky, he was trapped below decks as water began to rise, or caught in the path of a spreading fire, or simply too close to the explosion and died in the first seconds. The destroyermen and engineering crews who worked in the depths of the ships faced particular horror. They could not see the attacks happening. They could only feel the ship shudder when something hit, then darkness and heat, and the knowledge that if the compartment flooded, they were sealed in a steel tomb. Some ships lost propulsion when their engineering spaces flooded. An emotionless ship was an easy target for subsequent attacks. The crews understood this. They fought to keep the engines running, to keep the ship maneuverable, even as compartments around them flooded. Many American sailors who survived the Okinawa campaign were forever changed by the experience. Some developed what would later be recognized as combat trauma. Others simply learned to live with memories they could not share. The rituals that sailors developed, the gallows humor, the careful avoidance of becoming too close to men you knew would die, became thicker and more desperate as the weeks wore on. The strategic question underlying the entire Kamikaze campaign was whether it could actually accomplish what the Japanese intended. The commanders who planned the Kikusui attacks hoped to inflict such losses that the American fleet would either withdraw or be too damaged to support further operations on Okinawa. This was a fantasy born of desperation. The American fleet was too large, too well supplied, and too committed to being driven off by any Japanese offensive. The replacement ships, the spare pilots, the repair facilities that could return damaged vessels to service, America's industrial and human capacity simply exceeded anything Japan could match. The Japanese could sink American ships. They did sink American ships, but they could not break the American will or capacity to continue. Every kamikaze pilot who crashed into an American vessel died in the effort. Every aircraft launched on a one-way mission was an aircraft Japan could never replace. The Japanese military had committed to a strategy that required impossible numbers of successful attacks to change the outcome. The mathematics were brutal and inevitable. Japan would lose the battle of attrition. The Japanese high command understood this, even as they ordered the attacks. What motivated them was not a belief in victory, but a belief in the utility of forcing America to pay a higher price. If enough Americans died, perhaps the American people would agree to peace. If the invasion became too costly, perhaps American negotiators would accept something less than unconditional surrender. This reasoning was flawed, but it was the reasoning that sustained the Kamikaze campaign even as it consumed the last of Japan's trained pilots. The logistical details of the Kamikaze offensive reveal the scope of Japan's commitment to the strategy. The aircraft came from airfields across Kyushu, Formosa, and other bases within range of Okinawa. The Japanese had to assemble these squadrons, brief the pilots, load the aircraft with bombs, and time the launches so that waves would arrive over the fleet in coordinated assaults. This required communication networks, fuel supplies, ground crews, and maintenance facilities, all of which were under constant American air attack. The American Air Force and Navy pilots, when they were not defending against kamikaze attacks, were attacking the Japanese airfields, strafing aircraft on the ground, bombing hangars and fuel storage. The Japanese kept their aircraft dispersed, hidden under camouflage, moved to different locations to avoid being caught in the open. Yet they continued launching attacks. The dedication was almost incomprehensible to American observers. Japanese pilots were given routes to fly, target ships were identified, and they launched knowing the odds of returning were zero. Some wrote final letters to their families, some composed poems, some simply accepted the mission as the will of the emperor, the final service they could render. The combination of fanaticism, military discipline, and in many cases fear of what would happen if they refused, created an offensive that would continue until Japan simply ran out of aircraft and pilots. The effect on American naval strategy was immediate and practical. The Navy began withdrawing the larger, more valuable carriers from the Okinawa operation earlier than planned, rotating them back to rear areas for repairs, and to remove them from the concentrated target environment around the island. Smaller, less valuable ships were kept in the forward area. Anti-aircraft armament was increased on every available vessel. Special task groups were formed specifically to defend against air attacks. These measures helped, but they also represented a tactical victory for the Japanese strategy. They were forcing the Americans to change their operational patterns, to devote resources to defense rather than offense. As May progressed into June, the intensity of the attacks diminished. This was not because the Japanese had suddenly changed strategy, but because they were running out of aircraft and trained pilots. The pool of volunteers and conscripted pilots had been consumed at a rate that even Japan could not sustain. Each Kikusui operation cost hundreds of aircraft. By the end of the campaign, the Japanese were launching attacks with whatever they could send, including obsolete aircraft and pilots with minimal training. The final attacks were shadows of the coordinated masses earlier in the campaign. By the time organized resistance on Okinawa itself was ending, the Kamikaze campaign had effectively burned itself out. The naval losses and damage of the Okinawa campaign represented a watershed moment in American naval thinking. Over 30 American ships were sunk by kamikaze attack. More than 100 were damaged, some so severely they required months of repair. Nearly 5,000 sailors and Navy personnel died to the kamikazes, with thousands more wounded. The campaign demonstrated with stark clarity that suicide attacks, however irrational they seemed to American observers, could inflict unacceptable casualties. This realization had profound implications for American planners, considering the next operation, the invasion of the Japanese home islands. If Okinawa, an outlying island, could be defended with suicide attacks that killed thousands of Americans, what would the home islands be like? How many Americans would die if the Japanese turned entire civilian populations toward the same tactic they had used with the pilots? This fear, born in the waters around Okinawa, as radar picket destroyers were sunk one after another and escort carriers exploded in infernos of flame, would echo in the councils where American leaders debated whether to continue with the planned invasion or to seek other means of ending the war. The Kamikaze campaign had not changed the military outcome of the battle, but it had changed the calculations that American leaders would use when deciding how to end the war with Japan. The cost paid by American sailors in those waters in April, May, and June of 1945 would shape the decisions made in August when the atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. In the crowded operations room at Japanese Imperial Navy headquarters in Tokyo, there existed a terrible clarity of purpose. It was the 7th of April, 1945, and the 31st Fleet under Admiral Seiichi Ito had received its final orders. The battleship Yamato, the largest warship in the world, displacing nearly 71,000 tons, bristling with 9 18-inch guns that could hurl shells the weight of a small car more than 26 miles across open water, would make a one-way journey to Okinawa. She would not be returning. Her mission was not to fight a naval engagement in the classical sense, but rather to beach herself in the shallow waters off Hagushi, become a floating gun battery, and pour her devastating firepower into American positions until she was destroyed. It was a sacrifice calculated at the highest levels of Japanese command, an admission that the surface navy had no operational role left to play except to die in the manner considered most useful. The Yamato had been laid down in 1940, a secret project so vast and ambitious that her very existence was classified, even from many Japanese officers. She represented the apex of Japanese naval engineering, a leviathan designed in a different age, when capital ships still ruled the ocean, and the very act of launching a battleship was an expression of national power and strategic confidence. By 1945, the airplane had made such confidence obsolete, yet the Yamato floated still, a magnificent relic of a previous war waiting in the inland sea. She had seen action only twice, both times severely damaged, and had spent most of her final years hiding from American air superiority. Now, in the extremity of Japanese defeat, the Navy found in the Yamato a symbol and a tool. If she was to die, and everyone understood she would die, her death might at least delay the American advance and cost them lives. In the calculations of Japanese high command, this was sufficient justification. Admiral Ito understood the hopelessness of his task with a clarity that brought him no peace. He was 69 years old, a career naval officer who had seen the Navy diminish from its position of pride to near total irrelevance in the Pacific. His fleet for this operation consisted of the Yamato, 1 light cruiser, and 8 destroyers, a token force, adequate only to maintain some semblance of dignity as they traveled toward their appointed end. The fuel situation was dire. The Yamato carried enough oil to reach Okinawa, but not to return. Ito was told explicitly that if fuel permitted, the ship should attempt to return afterward. But this provision was itself a bitter fantasy. No one expected her to survive more than a few hours once she came within range of American carrier aircraft. The crew understood this as well. When the order was passed through the ship, there was no panic, only a grim and almost ceremonial acceptance. Men had been prepared for death for so long that finally receiving the certainty of it held an odd comfort. The Yamato and her escort sortied from the inland sea on the morning of the 6th of April, steaming southwestward into the East China Sea, and for hours the enormous ship moved through the waters without incident. Japanese officers scanned the horizons and skies with an intensity born of dread. The greater the apparent peace, the more sudden and violent the inevitable assault would be. Many of the crew had served long enough to understand the patterns of American carrier warfare. They would be found. They would be attacked from above in waves, waves that would keep coming until there was nothing left to destroy. The question was not whether this would happen, but when, and how much damage the ship could inflict in her brief window of combat. The American Navy had been tracking the Yamato's movements since she began her approach toward the Okinawa anchorage. Reconnaissance aircraft spotted the Japanese force on the morning of the 7th of April, reporting her position and course back to the Fast Carrier Task Force under Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher. The reaction was swift and assured. American pilots had spent 3 years learning to kill capital ships. They had sunk the Musashi, sister ship to the Yamato, in the waters off the Philippines the previous October, under assault from carrier aircraft. They understood the geometry of attack on a moving battleship, the patterns of evasion, and the limitations of anti-aircraft defense. Orders were issued immediately to launch strikes against the Japanese force. By mid-morning, the first wave of American aircraft, fighters, dive bombers, and torpedo bombers, totaling hundreds of planes from carriers, spread across a radius of more than 70 nautical miles, was inbound toward the Yamato and her escorts. The Japanese task force tightened its formation as the first reports of incoming aircraft crackled through the radio nets. Anti-aircraft guns were manned along the entire length of the Yamato, thousands of rounds loaded into magazines and brought to the guns. The enormous main battery could not be brought to bear against aircraft, but the fleet's heavy and light anti-aircraft armament was formidable. Dozens of guns, ranging from 25mm to 125mm, capable of putting an extraordinary volume of fire into the sky. The crew tensed, knowing that in minutes the vast bulk of their ship would become a magnet for American ordnance. There was nothing to do now but wait, aim, and try to knock down attackers before they could deliver their weapons. The sky to the north remained clear only for a moment longer. When the first wave of American dive bombers appeared through the clouds, they came in groups, plunging from altitude with their engines screaming. The Yamato heeled hard to port, trying to comb the incoming bomb runs, but the ship's enormous mass, nearly 2,000 feet in length, could not evade with the speed and nimbleness that survival required. The first bomb struck forward, a direct hit that tore through the weather deck and exploded deep in the hull. Then came another, and another. The anti-aircraft gunners were magnificent in their final combat, knocking down aircraft left and right, filling the sky with explosive shells that burst in clouds of black and white smoke. But for every American plane destroyed, 3 more pressed home their attacks. Torpedo bombers began their runs on the flanks, and the Yamato twisted and turned, her wake a pattern of white foam as she desperately maneuvered. The water around her erupted with the splash of near misses, sending great geysers upward that rained back down across her decks. The assault continued in waves for nearly 2 hours. American pilots showed no mercy and no hesitation. They attacked through the flak, took losses, and pressed on. The Yamato absorbed hit after hit. Bombs exploded in her magazines, sending bright flashes through her interior spaces. Torpedoes struck along her starboard side, opening massive wounds in her hull below the waterline. She was a floating city under attack, and the interior spaces became chambers of fire and chaos. The crew deep in the engine rooms worked frantically to maintain steam in her boilers, knowing that if the ship lost way, her vulnerability would increase infinitely. Men in ammunition handling rooms passed shells until they were overcome by smoke, and then others took their places. The damage control parties fought fires and tried desperately to patch breaches, a battle they were losing even as they fought it. Admiral Ito remained topside as long as he could, watching the sheets of water and fire and smoke that surrounded his ship. The Yamato was dying, and he knew it. The number of hits mounted beyond any threshold that even such a massive ship could endure. She had been designed to fight other battleships, to slug it out with American capital ships in a fleet engagement that never came. Instead, she was being killed from the air by an enemy she could neither see nor meaningfully defend against. It was, in a sense, the final validation of the strategic argument that had evolved throughout the war. The battleship was obsolete. The airplane was sovereign. The Yamato, for all her power and grandeur, was merely a target, albeit a very large and impressive one. The Yamato's final hours came as she burned and sank deeper into the ocean. By early afternoon, she was listing severely to starboard. The order was given to abandon ship. Men climbed over the side, jumping into water contaminated with oil and debris, some making for lifeboats and floats, others clutching bits of wreckage. Many never made it. The escort destroyers moved in to rescue survivors, picking men from the water, but there were thousands of sailors and nowhere near enough boats. The Yamato herself gave a final shudder and began her last roll. At 2:19 in the afternoon, on the 7th of April, 1945, the greatest battleship ever built capsized and went under. The water rushed over her, swallowing her enormous superstructure, her towering gun turrets, the flags that had marked her as the flagship of the Imperial fleet. She sank in approximately 1,000 feet of water, taking with her more than half of her crew. Of the 2,300 men aboard, fewer than 300 were rescued. The news of the Yamato's sinking rippled through Japanese high command, with a complex impact that was part numbness and part a strange validation. The sacrifice had been made, the final act of the surface navy had been performed, and in a practical military sense, the Yamato had accomplished almost nothing. She had not reached Okinawa. She had not become a floating battery. She had died uselessly, killed by an overwhelming superiority in air power that no amount of courage or determined seamanship could overcome. Yet for those who had ordered the mission, and for those in the Navy who cared about honor and tradition, the very fact of the attempt mattered. The Yamato had faced the enemy, had gone forward knowing the impossibility of the task, and had maintained her dignity even as history rendered her obsolete. In the context of 1945, when Japanese strategic options had narrowed to questions of how to die rather than how to survive, such considerations carried weight. For the Americans watching from their carriers and destroyers, the sinking of the Yamato was confirmation of what they already knew. The carrier had replaced the battleship as the dominant capital ship of modern warfare. Japanese surface naval power, once formidable and feared, had been reduced to symbolic gestures. The pilot reports came back, describing the enormous ship taking hit after hit, trying desperately to maneuver and fight back, becoming more crippled with each attack. It was, in its way, a mercy that she sank relatively quickly. A prolonged dying would have been worse for the surviving crew, and for those who would have had to continue attacking her. As it was, the Yamato was gone, pulled down by the weight of her own massive armor and the explosions that had torn through her hull, and the American forces turned their attention back to the waters around Okinawa and the continuing struggle to suppress the Japanese air attacks. The sinking of the Yamato stood as a kind of closing statement on the naval dimension of the Pacific War. What began with the battleship, the capital ship engagements of the first months of the war, would end with the battleship being hunted down and destroyed by the weapon that had always been her replacement. The Japanese had understood this transition intellectually, but the loss of the Yamato seemed to crystallize it in a way that was both clear and sorrowful. A nation that had built the greatest warship in the world, that had deployed it as an instrument of national will and power, had watched it sunk before it could fire a meaningful shot at an enemy. The Yamato's voyage to Okinawa was brief, and her campaign briefer still, but in her destruction lay a message written in fire and water, a message about the obsolescence of old forms of power in the face of new technological realities. The Pacific War would continue, but its last great capital ship was gone, resting on the ocean floor, a monument to a conception of naval warfare that the 20th century had rendered historical before the hull was even cold. The eerie silence of early April gave way to something far worse, the sound of war settling in for a long stay. By the second week of the month, American forces had pushed inland from the Hagushi beaches and struck the outer defenses of what would become known as the Shuri Line. The terrain shifted from open ground to a landscape of ridges, draws, and limestone outcroppings that seemed designed by nature to benefit the defender. Kakazu Ridge rose prominently across the central approach, a high ground position that Japanese engineers had spent months preparing with caves, tunnels, and carefully concealed gun positions. Behind it, to the west, lay Nishibaru, and to the east, Tanabaru, a series of mutually supporting heights that turned the approach into a three-dimensional killing box. American commanders studied their maps and their reconnaissance reports and came to an uncomfortable realization. The lightning campaign was over. What followed would be a grinding war of attrition, fought in terrain where every ridge gained cost men they could not replace, where progress meant measuring success not in miles, but in yards earned at terrible cost. The first assaults against Kakazu came from army units of the 24th Corps, commanded by officers accustomed to more conventional warfare. They attacked frontally, with infantry in loose formations, expecting firepower and momentum to carry the day. Japanese defenders let them come, let them advance far enough to commit fully, and then unleashed concentrated fire from positions the Americans had not seen, and in some cases had not suspected existed. The ridge itself was honeycombed with caves and fortified positions built into the reverse slope, invisible from the approaches the Americans were forced to take. Artillery shells would burst overhead, then machine gun fire would rake the exposed flanks. Mortar rounds would appear to come from nowhere, from positions integrated so completely into the limestone that even direct hits with artillery and airstrikes could not silence them all. Men who had survived the Pacific War for years found themselves pinned in draws and gullies, unable to move forward, unable to move back, and dying slowly in the mud beneath a grey sky. The attacking units took catastrophic casualties for nearly no ground gained. A company that advanced with 120 men sometimes withdrew with 30, their sacrifice measured in geographic features that still stood in Japanese hands at the end of the day. These battles quickly developed a repetitive and soul-crushing rhythm. Each dawn brought new orders and new assault plans. Unit commanders, operating under pressure from higher command to maintain momentum, would organize fresh attacks with whatever troops and resources remained. The men themselves knew the mathematics of what was happening. They saw the casualty lists, understood that their unit strength was being reduced by half and then half again, and yet they climbed out of their positions to attack ridges that had repelled identical assaults the day before. There was no tactical innovation that seemed to work, no flanking maneuver that could turn the Japanese position, no amount of supporting fire that could suppress the defenders long enough for the infantry to break through. The forward observers called for more artillery, for more airstrikes, for tank support, and American logistical machinery responded with staggering quantities of fire. But the Japanese, anticipating this, had built their positions accordingly. Caves had multiple entrances and exits, allowing defenders to abandon positions when shells fell, then return once the bombardment shifted to the next objective. It was a form of combat that exhausted both sides, that turned courage into futility, and that began, week after week, to wear men down to hollow shadows of themselves. Then the rains came. The seasonal tsuyu, the rainy season, began in late April and would persist through much of May, transforming Okinawa's already difficult terrain into a mud-bound nightmare that American soldiers had not experienced in the island-hopping campaign up to that point. The rain fell in torrential sheets, not the manageable rains of temperate climates, but thick walls of water that turned roads into rivers and turned the valleys beneath the ridges into swamps. Supply lines, already stretched thin, began to fail entirely. Jeeps bogged down in the mud, cargo trucks became immobilized, and ammunition had to be carried forward by hand in increasing quantities. Food rotted or became waterlogged. Medical supplies were precious, not because they were scarce at the supply depots, but because nothing could reach the forward positions with any regularity. The mud was not the soft mud of a temperate zone, but a thick, clay-like substance that clung to everything and made every movement an exhausting struggle. Men's feet, constantly wet, began to rot. Trench foot became an epidemic among the American forces, a medical problem as damaging to the combat strength of the army as enemy bullets. Soldiers would look down at their feet and see flesh turning gangrenous, toes dying, and they would report to aid stations knowing that losing their feet to disease was almost as likely as losing them to shrapnel. Fungal infections spread through the ranks. Dysentery and other gastrointestinal maladies afflicted men who had to eat cold rations while covered in mud and unable to maintain basic hygiene. The weather itself became as dangerous an enemy as the Japanese army. For the Japanese defenders in their caves and fortified positions, the rains brought their own form of suffering. The cave systems, which had been designed as protection from artillery and air attack, became damp tombs. Water seeped through the ceilings and walls, pooled on the floors, and rotted the stored supplies. Ammunition cases absorbed moisture and became unreliable. Food spoiled rapidly. The men living in these caves, unable to move about in daylight without drawing fire, emerged at night for water and supplies when they could venture out at all. Their own casualties mounted, not from combat alone, but from disease, from wounds that became infected in the damp conditions, from men simply breaking under the psychological strain of being trapped underground for weeks on end, with only explosions and the weight of earth above them for company. There was no rotation, no relief system, no rear area where a man could recover. You remained in the line until you were killed, wounded badly enough to require evacuation, or until your unit was pulled back to be reconstructed. Something that happened rarely for Japanese units, which typically stayed in position until destroyed. The cave entrances became choked with casualties. Men too wounded to move further back, too numerous to treat, dying slowly in the darkness, while the rain fell outside and artillery shells fell constantly above. The physical conditions degraded so completely that combat itself became almost secondary to the challenge of simply surviving the environment. Men lost the capacity to think clearly. Battle fatigue, what would later be called combat stress disorder, became epidemic on both sides. American troops would reach a ridge crest, secure it, and then find themselves unable to organize a defense or maintain discipline because they were so exhausted that simple commands seemed like abstract concepts from some distant language. Unit cohesion broke down. Replacements arriving as individuals rather than as units would find themselves in lines of men who barely knew each other, fighting alongside soldiers whose names they would never learn, whose faces they barely remembered, and whose absence after a few days would barely register because someone new would be in their position by the following sunrise. The casualty rotation meant that the men who survived the early battles, the ones with months or years of combat experience, were scattered throughout the line rather than concentrated in experienced units. Leadership became fragmented. Platoon sergeants were replaced by corporals with weeks of training. Squad leaders rotated out as casualties, and their replacements were green troops promoted in an emergency. Decisions that should have been made with tactical sophistication were instead made by exhausted men trying to remember their training through a fog of fatigue and fear. The Japanese command structure faced its own crisis of coherence. General Ushijima's 32nd Army was not monolithic. It contained experienced units and hastily formed ones, men who had fought across Southeast Asia and men who had been conscripted locally with almost no training. Communications between forward positions and army headquarters became increasingly difficult as American artillery destroyed telephone lines and radio networks were disrupted by the heavy rain and the electromagnetic effects of constant bombardment. Japanese officers found it increasingly difficult to execute complex tactical plans because information from the front took hours or days to arrive and was often incomplete or contradicted by other reports. The men in the forward caves had no way of knowing what orders were being issued at higher levels or what the overall situation was. They knew only that the explosions continued, that the Americans kept attacking, and that their position seemed to matter more to high command than their survival. Some units received orders to hold to the last man in positions that had already become untenable. Others were ordered to counterattack with insufficient forces. The logic of defense gave way to the logic of attrition, a numbers game in which both sides seemed willing to accept massive casualties as long as their casualties were smaller than the other side's. Neither side was winning this war. Both sides were simply bleeding. By late May, the human mathematics had become starkly clear. American units that had landed with full strength, a rifle company with 130 men, would have been reduced to 30 or 40 effectives, sometimes even fewer. These men would be rotated out, replaced by new arrivals, who themselves would be reduced to similar numbers within days or weeks. The American army could sustain these losses because there was a home country millions of people strong, a manufacturing base producing weapons and equipment at volumes that were almost incomprehensible, and a draft system that kept replacing the dead with new recruits. But each replacement cost time to arrive, to integrate, to train. The human cost was paid by the men themselves. The survivors accumulated trauma that no military system was equipped to address. They had watched friends die, had lived through bombardments that killed men they were standing next to, had dug graves or wrapped bodies in ponchos, had stepped over corpses to reach the next objective. The psychological cost was measured in troops becoming increasingly numb, increasingly disconnected from the violence around them, increasingly willing to commit actions of desperation or cruelty that represented a fundamental breaking of their pre-war selves. The Japanese defenders were sustaining losses at rates they simply could not replace. For all of General Ushijima's careful preparation, for all of the cave systems and defensive positions, the simple mathematics of sustained bombardment and repeated assaults was slowly destroying his army. A cave position, with 100 men defending it, could repel 5 or 6 assaults, but each repelled assault cost defenders killed or wounded. After weeks of continuous fighting, what had been a well-organized defensive position was now operated by fewer than half the original number of men. Japanese command doctrine did not include systematic rotation or relief. Soldiers stayed in position until they were incapacitated or killed. There was no medical evacuation system comparable to the American one. Japanese field hospitals, in the few instances where they existed, were overwhelmed with casualties that could not be treated and had to be left to die, or were killed by mercy injection when supplies ran out. The morale of the Japanese troops, which had seemed so resilient in the first weeks of fighting, began to fray under the weight of continuous attrition, with no relief, no reinforcements, and no indication that the Americans would somehow stop coming. Officers wrote letters home, some of which would be found by American troops, expressing the knowledge that this was a battle they would lose, that their sacrifice was part of a larger strategy designed to inflict enough casualties on the Americans to effect negotiated peace terms. This was no longer combat for victory. It was combat for delay, for denial, for stretching out the American casualty count, with the knowledge that each day of continued fighting made the next day's orders increasingly absurd. The terrain itself seemed to amplify this descent into grinding attrition. Every ridge was separated from the next by a draw or a valley, and every draw was defended by positions on the far side. There was no way to attack a ridge without first being exposed to fire from other positions. There was no way to advance without leaving exposed flanks. There was no breakthrough, no exploitation, no moment where momentum could be seized and converted into rapid gain of ground. Instead, each ridge had to be taken piece by piece, cleared of defenders, consolidated, only to discover that the next ridge was higher, more heavily fortified, and commanded better approaches. The American artillery was devastating in its quantity and reliability, but artillery alone could not win this battle. Someone had to climb the ridges, clear the caves, and kill or capture the defenders, and that meant sending men into positions where the Japanese could observe their approach and bring concentrated fire to bear. It meant accepting that for every ridge taken, there would be another one behind it, and another one behind that, stretching southward toward the island's tip. The promise of breakthrough faded. The hope for a quick victory disappeared. What remained was the grim certainty that this was how the war would be decided, not by maneuver or surprise, but by the willingness of one side to suffer more casualties and keep fighting longer than the other side. The psychological impact of this recognition, that the campaign would be decided by who could endure attrition the longest, manifested in small ways and large ones. American officers began making decisions based on minimizing their own losses rather than on gaining ground. Some commanders became more cautious, more willing to call for additional artillery and air support before committing infantry, even if this meant delaying the attack. Others became more aggressive, believing that if enough force was applied quickly enough, the position might break. Neither approach consistently worked. The men themselves, sensing that their officers were dealing with a tactical problem that had no solution, began to take psychological refuge in small group identity. A man did not fight for Okinawa, or for strategic objectives, or for America. He fought because the men beside him were fighting, because abandoning his position meant abandoning them, because a kind of moral gravity kept pulling him into the line each morning, regardless of what his mind was telling him. The bravery was often unconscious, men performing acts of tactical brilliance or personal courage while operating in a state of dissociation from reality, seeing the world through a fog of exhaustion and stress that nearly separated them from their own actions. By the end of May, the ridges had been taken one by one. Kakazu, Nishibaru, Tanabaru, and dozens of lesser positions. But the Shuri line remained unbroken as a complete defensive system. The Japanese had conducted a masterful fighting withdrawal, abandoning positions before they could be fully encircled, maintaining their line's integrity even as individual ridges fell. American casualties had mounted to levels that shocked commanders and shocked the public back home when casualty figures were released. The Japanese army, meanwhile, had been reduced to perhaps half its original strength, its officer corps decimated, its reserve units committed and destroyed, its ability to fight a coherent defense approaching its limit. Both sides knew that the war was approaching its climax, that the next phase of fighting would determine whether the Shuri line could be finally broken and the Japanese army destroyed. The rains continued, the mud remained, and exhausted men on both sides prepared for battles that would dwarf everything that had come before. By the first week of May 1945, the American advance against the Shuri line had ground into a brutal stalemate. Days of rain turned the southern battlefield into a landscape of mud and suffering. American units attacking Kakazu Ridge, Nishibaru Ridge, and Tanabaru Ridge were suffering casualties at rates that horrified commanders. Casualty statistics were climbing faster than territory gained. Some battalion commanders were losing more men than they could effectively replace. The momentum that had carried American forces across the initial landing zones had evaporated entirely. What had once seemed like a swift knockout blow against the Japanese defenders was now revealing itself as a campaign of attrition that neither side could afford. On the Japanese side, General Mitsuru Ushijima and his chief of staff, Colonel Hiromichi Yahara, faced a strategic choice that would define the final phase of the battle. For weeks, their doctrine had been purely defensive. The Shuri line was built to absorb punishment, to exact a price from American attackers, to make every meter of ground cost American lives. But purely defensive warfare meant slowly losing ground without inflicting enough damage to break the American will or the American capacity to continue fighting. Ushijima and Yahara understood something crucial. The Americans would eventually break through the Shuri line through sheer weight of numbers and material. American air power would eventually overwhelm any fixed position. American naval gunfire would pound their defenses until they crumbled. The mathematics of the situation were against them. But perhaps, they reasoned, a carefully timed counteroffensive could disrupt American momentum, shatter American units before they could fully concentrate, and recapture the initiative, at least temporarily. The decision to attack represented a fundamental shift in Japanese doctrine on Okinawa. Ushijima ordered the 32nd Army to prepare a major offensive operation, codenamed Yutaka Sakusen, for the early days of May. The plan was ambitious and desperate in equal measure. Japanese forces would launch simultaneous attacks across the entire front, with the main assault coming from the western anchor of the Shuri line, around the Sugarloaf Hill complex. At the same time, Japanese naval forces and specially trained amphibious assault troops would attempt a flanking landing on the American rear, striking at supply dumps and command posts behind the front lines. Japanese artillery would be massed to create a storm of fire in support of the infantry advance. The hope was that this three-pronged assault would catch the Americans off balance, spread their attention across multiple threats, and create an opportunity to maul American units piecemeal. Even if the counteroffensive ultimately failed, it might buy time and blood to strengthen the southern defenses. For the men who would carry out this assault, the counteroffensive represented a dramatic change in combat operations. For weeks they had endured American bombardment from the air, from naval gunfire, and from artillery. They had repelled American ground attacks from prepared positions. Now they were ordered to abandon those positions, at least temporarily, and move to assault positions under American fire. Japanese infantry companies and battalions received their orders in the rain. Sergeants and junior officers gathered their men in the caves and tunnels of the Shuri line and explained what was coming. The troops who would lead the assault were among the best trained and most combat-hardened soldiers in the 32nd Army. Some had survived the fight in the Philippines. Others had endured the grinding combat in Manchuria before the war. But all of them understood the mathematics as well as their generals did. They were attacking an enemy with more air power, more artillery, more men, more supplies, and more industrial capacity. The odds were against them, but the order had come from General Ushijima himself, and obedience was absolute. The Japanese counteroffensive was launched during the night of the 3rd of May, 1945. In darkness and rain, Japanese infantry began moving out of the Shuri line toward American positions to the west and north. The terrain they had to cross was broken and treacherous. American artillery, even at night, was constant and deadly. Flares lit the darkness, turning night into a grotesque daylight that made the attacking troops visible to American defenders. Japanese engineers struggling to carry supplies forward found themselves struggling against both the terrain and American firepower, but the Japanese assault went forward anyway. On the western side of the battlefield, near Naha, Japanese forces struck the American line in the area held by the 6th Marine Division. The assault was fierce and sustained. Japanese troops, moving in waves, surged into American positions. Some breached the American line. For brief hours, the Japanese achieved something they had not achieved before on Okinawa. They had forward momentum. They had regained the initiative. The fighting became desperate and confused almost immediately. In the darkness, in the rain, with both sides fighting in terrain they did not fully understand, the battle dissolved into a series of vicious, small-unit engagements. Japanese soldiers charged American foxholes. American Marines and soldiers, alerted by their commanders and by the sheer violence of the assault, fought from their positions with rifles, grenades, and machine guns. Tanks that could be brought forward through the mud and rain added their firepower to the defense. The Japanese achieved their deepest penetrations in the western sector, where at one point, assault companies broke through the Marine defensive line and threatened to drive all the way to supply areas far behind American lines. For a few hours, some American officers were genuinely concerned about how deep the Japanese penetration might reach. Messages flew through American command channels. Reserves that had been held for other purposes were hastily committed to plug the gap in the line. Artillery was shifted to pound the breakthrough areas. American pilots were alerted to conduct close air support missions as soon as dawn came, and the rain cleared enough for flying operations. But the counteroffensive's momentum could not sustain itself. The Japanese assault had been bold and well coordinated, but it had been executed across a frontage that was too wide and with reserves that were insufficient to exploit the early successes. As American reserves flowed into the gap in the line, the Japanese breakthrough began to be contained. By the morning of the 4th of May, American units that had been heavily engaged during the night were able to stabilize their positions. The rain had begun to lighten slightly. American aircraft began to appear over the battlefield. What had been chaos and darkness in the night became a grinding attritional battle in the daylight. And in daylight, the American advantages in firepower and air power were overwhelming. Japanese forces that had penetrated American lines found themselves cut off from supply, surrounded, and subject to devastating fire. Some small groups fought to the last man rather than surrender. Others began to withdraw back toward the Shuri line. The amphibious flanking assault that was supposed to strike American supply areas behind the front lines achieved almost nothing. Japanese boats and small craft attempted to land troops on the American rear, but American forces were vigilant, and the amphibious assault was detected almost immediately. Naval gunfire, artillery, and American ground units annihilated the Japanese landing force with relative ease. The American command, which had feared a serious threat to its supply lines and command posts, found that the actual Japanese effort was far smaller and less coordinated than had been feared. The amphibious element of the counteroffensive collapsed almost as soon as it began. It had consumed Japanese troops and vessels that could not be replaced, and it had achieved nothing. By the 5th of May, the Japanese counteroffensive was clearly failing. American units, no longer on the defensive, were pushing back hard against the Japanese assault forces. The weather was improving. American air power was becoming more and more effective. Japanese units that had advanced furthest from the Shuri line found themselves in increasingly untenable situations. Orders came down for Japanese forces to disengage and withdraw back toward their original positions. But withdrawal in the face of an American advance was every bit as costly as the assault had been. Japanese soldiers had to move back over the same broken terrain under American artillery and air fire. The wounded and the dead had to be left behind or laboriously carried by exhausted men. Supply lines that had been temporarily displaced had to be re-established. The cohesion of units that had been shattered in the assault began to fray further, as withdrawal turned into something approaching a rout in some sectors. By the 6th of May, the Japanese counteroffensive had been completely repulsed. In less than 3 days, the entire operation had failed. Japanese forces had lost some of the best remaining combat troops in the 32nd Army. The artillery ammunition that had been stockpiled for the assault had been expended and could not be replaced. Supply depots had been raided to equip the attacking forces, and much of that equipment had been left on the battlefield. The Japanese had inflicted casualties on the American forces, to be sure, but they had also shattered their own defensive capacity. The Shuri line, which had been rebuilt and reinforced after each American assault, could not be rebuilt and reinforced after this catastrophe. The Japanese 32nd Army had fewer men, less ammunition, less food, and less will than it had possessed before the counteroffensive began. General Ushijima and Colonel Yahara had learned a bitter lesson. An army fighting a defensive campaign against a militarily superior enemy cannot afford to surrender the initiative, even temporarily, in an attempt to regain it. Every counterattack, no matter how brilliant its conception, consumed resources that could never be replenished. Every Japanese soldier who fell in the assault was a man who could not defend the line when the Americans attacked. Every round of artillery ammunition that was fired could not be preserved for future defensive operations. The calculation that Ushijima and Yahara had made in the first days of May had been proven catastrophically wrong. They had sacrificed the strength of their defensive position in hopes of breaking American momentum. Instead, they had merely hastened the inevitable collapse of that defensive position. The American command, watching the Japanese counteroffensive unfold and then crumble, drew different conclusions from what they saw. The Japanese were desperate enough to throw away trained troops in futile assaults. The Japanese were running out of ammunition and supplies. The Japanese were willing to accept casualties at rates that were destroying their army. These were signs that the 32nd Army was reaching the end of its capacity to resist, but they were also signs that the remaining weeks of fighting would be even more vicious and costly than what had already occurred. Japanese soldiers, as the hope of victory receded, might be even more willing to fight to the death. Suicide attacks and suicidal charges would likely increase. The campaign was entering a new and darker phase, but the Japanese counteroffensive, for all its ferocity and all its initial shock to American forces, had accelerated the end. The Shuri line, weakened beyond recovery, would begin to crack within days. By mid-May, The American advance had stalled against the Shuri Line's western anchor. The Japanese defensive belt curved southward through terrain that seemed to have been designed by nature specifically to break infantry assaults. And there, rising from the muddy landscape like a fortress, stood 3 connected hills that would consume the next 2 weeks of the 6th Marine Division's existence. Sugarloaf Hill dominated the western sector, with Horseshoe Ridge curving around its left flank and Half Moon Hill anchoring the position further south. These were not natural features that the Japanese had merely occupied. They were meticulously prepared strongholds, honeycombed with caves, laced with artillery pieces, sited to support each other, and garrisoned with men who understood that this ground would determine whether the Shuri Line held or collapsed. The Japanese had studied American tactics for months. They knew the Americans favored frontal assaults, and they had shaped Sugarloaf and its companions to punish exactly that doctrine. Every ridgeline was reverse-sloped to shelter defenders from preliminary bombardment. Every draw that seemed to offer cover actually led into interlocking fields of fire. The positions commanded the western approaches to Naha, the island's capital, and their loss would crack open the entire defensive system. The Marines who faced this ground in the second week of May had already been fighting for more than a month. They had crossed beaches, seized airfields, and pushed northward through the Monobu Peninsula's jungle hell. Now they were being turned southward to smash into the meat grinder. The divisions rotating into line were not fresh. They were tired, depleted by casualty replacement and the simple attrition of sustained combat. Men who had landed on the 1st of April were still breathing on the 16th, but many of them had the hollow look of soldiers who understood the mathematics of their survival. The first assaults on Sugarloaf came on the 12th of May from the south and west simultaneously. Companies of Marines moved up the slopes in daylight, exposed on terrain that offered no natural cover. Japanese artillery on the reverse slopes waited until the Marines were committed before unleashing fire that turned the slopes into charnel houses. The first attack broke apart. So did the second. By the end of that day, the Marines had counted their losses and pulled back to reorganize. In the following days, the pattern became horrifyingly routine. Dawn would bring reports that today would be different, that this assault would break through. Officers would brief their men with maps and aiming points. Chaplains would move through the lines offering last rites and quiet words. By noon, the assault would have failed, and the slopes would be strewn with dead and dying Marines. The artillery and mortar fire did not discriminate. It fell on the Japanese too, but the Japanese defenders were sheltered in caves and bunkers, while American ground forces assaulted over open slopes. Wave after wave was thrown against Sugarloaf, and wave after wave was broken. The 2nd and 3rd Battalions of the 22nd Marines took their turns. Then the 29th Marines. Then the 4th Marine Regiment rotated in, and then the 5th. Each unit discovered the same terrible truth. The position could not be taken by frontal assault. The flanking positions at Horseshoe and Half Moon had to be reduced first, or the defenders on Sugarloaf would pour enfilade fire into any Marine formation that reached the crest. This meant the Marines had to expand the battle across a wider sector, which meant more men pushed into the killing ground, which meant more casualties with no breakthrough in sight. The weather had worsened by mid-May. The seasonal rains that plagued Okinawa had begun in earnest, turning the muddy slopes into slicks of clay and water. Men could not maintain footing. Vehicles bogged down. Ammunition had to be carried forward by hand, across terrain that became progressively more treacherous. The artillery and mortar fire that fell continuously seemed somehow worse in the rain. Marines learned to distinguish between the sound of incoming Japanese shells and American counter-battery fire. They learned to read weather and timing, to move in the minutes of relative quiet between bombardments. They developed the 1,000 small superstitions that keep men sane when they are surrounded by random death. The fighting for Sugarloaf reached its crescendo around the 16th and 17th of May. On the 16th, after days of preliminary assaults that had reduced Japanese strength on the southern slopes, the 29th Marines launched what was intended to be the decisive attack. This time, they seized the crest. Marines planted their banner on Sugarloaf's summit and dug in, expecting immediate counterattack. It came that night with a fury that seemed to be drawing on the last reserves of Japanese courage. In darkness, Japanese infantry charged up the slopes in waves, and in the chaos of night combat, the Marines found themselves isolated on the hilltop, cut off from reinforcement and resupply. The fighting on the summit was bayonet and grenade work. It was hand-to-hand and utterly desperate. By morning, the surviving Marines were still on Sugarloaf, but barely. They had held through the night by sacrificing men to keep the Japanese from overwhelming them, and their position was precarious. Ammunition was running low. Casualties had reduced the company to a shadow of its original strength, but they held. Throughout the 17th, reinforcement and resupply attempts continued, despite the artillery and mortar fire that made every approach to the hilltop a gauntlet. Tanks moved up to supporting positions and lent their fire. By afternoon, the Marine position on Sugarloaf had stabilized enough that it appeared they might retain the crest. Even as the Marines held Sugarloaf, sister units continued the brutal work of reducing Horseshoe and Half Moon. These positions fell more slowly, requiring independent assault after assault, as the defending Japanese fought with the knowledge that their sacrifice on these ridges might buy time for the main defensive line to reorganize farther south. The fighting for the three hills continued in intensity until late May, with the positions changing hands more than a dozen times over the course of days. Marines would seize a position at terrible cost, only to have Japanese counterattacks drive them off. The next assault would follow, and the cycle would repeat. Supply lines became a central preoccupation. Men could not fight without water, ammunition, and food, and all of it had to be carried up muddy slopes under fire. The quartermaster and supply units working far behind the lines understood that the men at Sugarloaf and Horseshoe and Half Moon were literally exhausting themselves. They were burning through ammunition faster than it could be brought forward. They were losing men so quickly that casualties were being replaced by untrained replacements, who often did not survive their first day in line. The intensity of the fighting at Sugarloaf began to slacken slightly by the 19th and 20th of May. The Japanese counterattacks became fewer and weaker. The artillery fire, though still present and lethal, seemed to be slackening. Intelligence reports suggested that the Japanese were beginning their withdrawal from the Shuri line, pulling forces southward toward a new defensive position in the southern hills. The seizure of Sugarloaf, Horseshoe, and Half Moon had cracked the western anchor of the Shuri line. It was not the breakthrough that the Marine commanders had hoped for, but it was a breakthrough nonetheless. The Shuri line, which had seemed impregnable just days before, was collapsing under coordinated pressure from north and east and west. The cost of Sugarloaf had been measured in the near-complete destruction of the units that fought there. Companies that had landed on Okinawa 6 weeks earlier had been reduced to platoons. Platoons had been reduced to squads. Individual Marines who had survived every battle and bombardment were suddenly gone, replaced by the mathematics of attrition and chance. The 6th Marine Division as a whole would lose more than 500 men in the fighting for the three hills, and many of those losses came from a handful of battalions that bore the weight of the assault. The Marines who held those hilltops in late May looked like ghosts of their earlier selves. They were gaunt from weeks of inadequate rations and the psychological pressure of constant combat. They were hollow-eyed from the deaths of friends and the understanding that they themselves were temporary survivors. likely to be killed or wounded before the island was fully secured. Yet they held. That was what would be remembered about Sugarloaf and the Marines who took it. Not the strategy or the tactics, but the simple, terrible fact that young men, exhausted and broken and afraid, chose to remain and fight when they could have surrendered or retreated. They held the hilltop until the war came to them, and then they pushed forward into the next objective. The reduction of Sugarloaf, Horseshoe, and Half Moon marked a turning point in the Okinawa campaign. The Shuri Line was no longer a unified defensive belt. It was a series of isolated positions that could no longer support each other. The Japanese High Command's decision to withdraw southward was becoming inevitable, and the final phase of the campaign, the pursuit into the southern hills, and the complete destruction of the 32nd Army, was about to begin. By late May, the grinding attrition that had defined the previous weeks had begun to tell on both sides. The American Army, reinforced and resupplied, had learned the pattern of the Shuri Line's defense, the interlocking ridges, the reverse slopes that protected Japanese artillery from American airstrikes, the endless maze of caves and tunnels that transformed terrain into a living fortress. The Japanese, meanwhile, had suffered losses that could not be replaced. Their counteroffensive in early May had cost them thousands of men and had not broken the American line. General Mitsuru Ushijima and his chief of staff, Colonel Hiromichi Yahara, knew with the clarity of men watching their hopes contract that they were fighting a battle they could no longer win. What remained was how to fight it. How long could they make the Americans bleed? How many more days could they buy for the homeland? The American strategy for breaking the stalemate began to take shape around the second week of May. The objective was not merely to capture pieces of terrain, but to collapse the entire Shuri Line at once, to create a moment of rupture that the Japanese could not repair. To the east, the army would press against Kakazu and the ridges around it, hammering at the line where it anchored to the backbone of the island. To the west, the Marines of the 3rd Amphibious Corps would break through at Sugarloaf and the Horseshoe, positions they had been fighting for since mid-May, with mounting casualties and mounting determination. Once both flanks began to give way, the entire position would become untenable. The Japanese would have to withdraw. The only question was whether they would be able to withdraw in order, or whether the collapse would become a rout. The weather during this period became almost another combatant on the battlefield. Rain fell in sheets that turned the gullies between ridges into temporary watercourses, and the level ground into a red mud so thick and heavy that vehicles bogged down and men sank calf-deep with each step. Artillery pieces had to be repositioned constantly as the ground beneath them liquefied. Ammunition trucks slid off roads that existed only in dry conditions. The wounded lay in mud-filled foxholes, waiting for evacuation that took hours or days, because the helicopters could not fly, and the ground ambulances moved at walking pace. For the Americans, the rain was a torment. For the Japanese, already short of supplies and unable to move reinforcements or ammunition in the open daylight, it was something approaching a catastrophe. Their supply lines, fragile at the best of times, almost ceased to function. On the 23rd of May, the American 6th Marine Division, under the command of Major General Lemuel Shepard, pushed through the Sugarloaf position after days of savage fighting. The Marines had taken and lost the hill repeatedly over the preceding week, each assault meeting machine gun and mortar fire from the mutually supporting positions nearby. But on this day, with the western flank of the Shuri Line beginning to buckle and Japanese forces committed heavily to the east, the Marines finally broke through. To their left, Army units of the 27th Infantry Division were making progress against the ridges. The American commanders sensed something they had not felt in weeks, a moment of opportunity. For the Japanese, the moment of decision had arrived. The Shuri line, which had held against every assault and repeated American breakthroughs, was becoming a trap rather than a fortress. To hold the line would be to risk encirclement. To withdraw was to abandon the hope of a negotiated peace and accept the necessity of a fighting retreat to the southern end of the island. Ushijima convened a staff meeting on the night of the 24th of May. The decision he faced was among the most significant of his command, whether to hold Shuri at all costs or to execute a fighting withdrawal. Colonel Yahara argued for the withdrawal. The position, he insisted, was no longer defensible once the flanks had begun to collapse. The cost of holding would be annihilation with no strategic gain. It was time to execute what the Japanese called a delay in depth, a fighting retreat through successive defensive lines that would continue to inflict casualties on the Americans while preserving the army's strength for the final struggle. Ushijima, despite his reputation as an aggressive commander, willing to pay any price for time, listened to his chief of staff and agreed. The order went out to the division commanders that night. Shuri would be abandoned. The 32nd Army would withdraw southward, under cover of darkness, to a new defensive line around Yusadake and Kunishi Ridge. The operation would begin at midnight. What followed was one of the most difficult operations in warfare, a night withdrawal from a defensive position while under constant artillery bombardment and in contact with an advancing enemy. The Japanese had to time their withdrawal so that the Americans would not notice it until the rearguard was clear. They moved slowly, deliberately, in darkness, broken only by the occasional American flare. Artillery pieces that could not be moved quickly enough were destroyed by their crews. Supplies that had been laboriously stockpiled were blown in place or abandoned. The wounded who could walk were sent rearward. Those who could not be moved remained behind, tended to the end by volunteer medics who chose to stay and face capture. It was a retreat conducted with discipline and order, the mark of an army that had learned through weeks of bitter fighting how to preserve its cohesion under impossible circumstances. One Marine regiment, the 1st Regiment of the 5th Marine Division, was in position on the western approaches to Shuri that night. The rain was falling so heavily that visibility was reduced to mere yards. In the confusion and noise of the storm and the artillery, the Marines realized that the Japanese fire had diminished, then ceased entirely. Scouts probed forward and found the positions empty. The regiment's commander made a decision that would stir controversy in the histories written afterward. Rather than halt and consolidate, awaiting orders and allowing the Japanese to establish their new line, the regiment would push forward through the darkness and the rain. They would seize Shuri Castle before the Japanese could reoccupy it or destroy it. It was a bold move, motivated by the knowledge that speed might matter in ways that caution could not guarantee. The Marines moved forward into darkness, not knowing whether they were advancing into an ambush or genuinely finding an opening. The rain and the darkness worked in favor of the Marines that night. Japanese rearguard elements, engaged in their own difficult withdrawal, did not contest the American advance as strongly as they might have in daylight. The Marines moved in loose files, listening for the sounds of movement and watching for muzzle flashes that would mark Japanese positions. They reached the outskirts of Shuri in the pre-dawn hours and began to advance toward the castle, a structure whose symbolic importance transcended its tactical value. Shuri had been the royal seat of the Ryukyu kingdom before Japan's imperial expansion, and it had endured for centuries as a repository of Okinawan cultural memory. Now it stood as a military objective, a position to be captured or destroyed like any other piece of ground. The Marines pressed forward, and by first light on the 25th of May, they had reached the castle's outer walls and were bringing their weapons to bear against the Japanese defenders who still occupied parts of the structure. The fighting for Shuri Castle itself was brief but intense. The Marines assaulted the remaining Japanese positions with grenades and automatic weapons fire, engaging defenders who were now motivated by the knowledge that they were fighting the final moments before the withdrawal deadline. The Japanese defenders killed and wounded Marine after Marine as the assault developed, but they could not hold. The weight of numbers and firepower was against them, and their commander, judging the position no longer tenable, ordered the remaining defenders to conduct their own delaying withdrawal toward the south. By mid-morning on the 25th of May, Marines of the 5th Regiment stood atop Shuri Castle, raising the American flag over the ancient structure as their comrades watched from the surrounding ridges. The symbolism was potent. The fall of Shuri meant the fall of the Shuri Line. The strongest fortress that the Japanese had built had been breached and taken. Yet the tactical reality was more complex than the symbolic moment suggested. The Japanese had not been driven from Shuri in defeat. They had withdrawn in order, preserving their army for the next phase of battle. The American commanders, examining their maps and considering the disposition of Japanese forces, understood this with some frustration. Ushijima's army had not been annihilated. It had not even been broken. It had simply chosen not to fight in that particular place any longer. The 32nd Army, now south of the former Shuri Line, was organizing a new defensive position. The Marines and soldiers who advanced southward over the next days and weeks would find that the campaign was not ending. It was merely transitioning to its final phase. The Japanese withdrawal from Shuri had demonstrated something important about the nature of the fighting that had consumed May. For all the American pressure and all the Japanese casualties, General Ushijima retained enough control over his forces to execute a complex military operation in darkness and under fire. The regiments of the 32nd Army, exhausted and depleted though they were, maintained their unit cohesion and their fighting capability. They had learned to move, to reorganize, and to continue fighting. If the Americans had expected the fall of Shuri to mean the effective end of organized Japanese resistance, they were mistaken. The destruction of the Shuri Line was a milestone, not a conclusion. The most brutal phase of the campaign still lay ahead. The moment atop Shuri Castle was a moment of visible triumph, but incomplete victory. The Americans could see now that their landing on the beaches 75 days before, which had seemed to promise a quick campaign, had led instead to a battle of unprecedented length and cost. The seizure of the symbolic center of Okinawa changed nothing about the fundamental mathematics of the struggle ahead. There remained thousands of Japanese soldiers, thousands more American soldiers to be committed, and still the question that haunted American planners: how many more men would have to die to finish this island before the war could move on to the home islands themselves? The flag flew from Shuri Castle, but Okinawa remained a fortress, and the Japanese army remained unbroken in the south, waiting in rain and darkness for the Americans to come and find them. By the end of May, the Japanese 32nd Army was no longer defending a line. It was dissolving into fragments, compressed into the jagged southern tip of Okinawa, like the last light of day squeezed between dark clouds. General Ushijima, watching the collapse of the Shuri positions, made a calculated choice that separated him from the wild-eyed desperation of Tokyo. Rather than fight and die where he stood, he would withdraw his remaining forces southward, into terrain that favored defense just as much as the line he was abandoning, maybe more. The American commanders who had won the Shuri Line expected to pursue scattered remnants. What they found instead was another fortress, hastily prepared but no less lethal, formed by the very geography that made southern Okinawa a maze of ridges and valleys, each one a potential grave. The Japanese army that had lost its carefully constructed defensive belt simply moved to the next natural wall the island offered, and the battle entered its final, and in some ways most savage phase. The Americans, exhausted and already believing the end was in sight, would have to fight through terrain that seemed to grow more difficult with every kilometer gained. The Oroku Peninsula jutted westward from the southern Okinawa coast, a rugged hook of land that the Japanese Navy's Second Fleet had used as a major seaplane base in the early years of the war. Now it was empty of aircraft, empty of fuel, empty of supplies, but full of soldiers. The peninsula's garrison, roughly 3,000 naval personnel and marines, came under the command of Rear Admiral Minoru Ota, a man who had watched his service branch wither from global power to a few thousand desperate men with rifles. Rather than accept incorporation into Ushijima's army or withdrawal, Ota chose to hold the peninsula as long as possible, turning narrow coastal roads and ravines into killing zones where every meter of advance cost blood. To the east of the peninsula, the hills rose toward the ridgelines that would come to dominate the final chapter of the Okinawa campaign. Konishi Ridge, Yuzadake, and Yaejudake formed a tilted wall across southern Okinawa, their slopes steep enough in places to be nearly vertical, their crests offering commanding sightlines over the approaches from the north. It was the last formation of terrain that offered any real advantage to the defense, and the 32nd Army knew it. The Americans who pushed into this region were no longer the men who had crossed the Hagushi beaches 50 days earlier. They were reduced by casualties, stripped of illusions about how quickly this battle would end, and fighting not from momentum, but from the terrible weight of orders that required them to keep moving. The 1st Marine Division, which had already suffered enormously in the campaign, took the primary responsibility for breaching the western anchor of the Japanese defenses, while army units pressed toward the central and eastern ridges. The Marines found that Oroku Peninsula, for all its reputation as a minor position, required a full-scale amphibious assault to take it. On the 29th of May, 3 days after the fall of Shuri Castle, 2 companies of the 8th Marines crossed the narrow waters between the main island and the peninsula, wading ashore into a beach defended by entrenched naval personnel who fought with the particular intensity of men who had nowhere left to go. The peninsula, barely 2 kilometers long and irregular in shape, became a small war unto itself, a final distillation of every brutal tactic that had characterized the campaign. Machine gun fire from fortified positions raked the beaches. Anti-tank guns, now that tanks themselves were scarce, were repositioned as direct fire artillery against advancing infantry. Every caves and ravine became a strong point, not because of careful planning, but because the terrain itself almost demanded it. Admiral Ota's decision to fight to the last man was not born from delusion. Unlike the mainland commanders who could rationalize their orders through the lens of grand strategy, Ota understood with brutal clarity that his position was a sideshow, a delaying action, a way to buy Ushijima time that might never be spent. Yet he chose it anyway, and his men, sailors who had never been trained for ground combat, learned in a matter of days what months of warfare had taught the army units further north. The Marines, for their part, approached Oroku with a grim professionalism. They had learned how to clear caves and fortified positions at enormous cost. They had learned how to advance through broken terrain under fire. What they had not learned, and what Okinawa refused to teach them anyway except through experience, was how to make this easier. It was not easier. It took nearly 2 weeks to clear Oroku Peninsula, 2 weeks of cave clearing and ridge fighting, of positions captured and then held against counterattacks that came out of the darkness. By the time Ota was confirmed dead, his body never found, but his command clearly destroyed, the American units involved in the Oroku operation had acquired another set of hard lessons and another collection of irreplaceable losses. But Oroku was the sideshow. The main battle was elsewhere, where the heights of southern Okinawa held the Japanese 32nd Army in its final configuration. Kunishi Ridge, a formation that ran roughly east to west across the southern portion of the island, became the focal point of the campaign's endgame. To American planners looking at maps, Kunishi Ridge was simply the next objective, another piece of terrain to be taken in a campaign that had become a grinding exercise in map reading and objective capture. To the Marines who approached it in early June, Kunishi was something far more immediate. A steep-sided ridge crowned with enemy positions, surrounded by open ground that offered no cover and no protection, rising out of a landscape that seemed to get worse with each passing day. The spring rains that had plagued both armies in May had evolved into something approaching a monsoon. The ground, already churned to mud by weeks of artillery bombardment, had become nearly impassable. Trucks bogged down miles from the front, supply lines stretched to breaking points. And through it all, the Japanese on the ridge above, having prepared their positions for exactly this kind of defensive action, waited. The assault on Kunishi Ridge began on the 4th of June, launched by the 1st Marine Division, with all the coordination and firepower that American resources could bring to bear. Preliminary bombardment, as thorough as logistics could manage, preceded the assault. Artillery fire churned the ridgetop, and Marines advanced under cover of this fire toward the base of the slope. What happened next would characterize much of the final phase of the Okinawa campaign. Initial success, followed by the grim realization of isolation and entrapment. The Marines took the crest of Kunishi in darkness on the night of the 5th and 6th of June, a costly assault that left the survivors gasping and exhausted at the top of a ridge that seemed to stretch in all directions away from them. They were isolated. The steepness of the slope that had protected them during the assault now became a liability, making it nearly impossible for supporting infantry to reach them with supplies or reinforcements. They held approximately 40 meters of the ridge crest, a fragile grip on terrain that the Japanese clearly intended to retake. What followed was a desperate gamble that illustrated the particular resources that American forces possessed and Japanese forces lacked. Heavy tanks, which had become increasingly rare as the campaign progressed due to Japanese anti-tank weapons and losses from combat, were nevertheless committed to the Kunishi operation. American armored and engineers worked frantically to widen the approaches to Kunishi Ridge so that tanks could be brought up to resupply the Marines on the crest. The ridge's slope, never designed for vehicular traffic, was carved, and explosives were used to cut a rough path wide enough for a tank to navigate. Over the course of several days, tanks climbed the slope at night, bringing ammunition, water, rations, and blood plasma to the isolated Marines above. It was an operation that would have been impossible a year earlier, but by June 1945, the Americans had learned to use their industrial advantage in ways large and small. The tanks themselves became makeshift gun emplacements, their main guns providing direct fire support against Japanese positions on the surrounding ridges. At night, concealed during daylight, these vehicles were the only link between the Marines on top of Kunishi and the supply lines far below. The Japanese counterattacks came with the rhythm of nightfall and desperation. Units retreating from positions further north, gathering at assembly areas in the ravines below the ridge, would attack upward in darkness, attempting to overwhelm the isolated Marine positions before dawn broke and American air power could be brought to bear. The fighting on Kunishi Ridge became a series of nocturnal battles, with grenades and small arms fire consuming the darkness in flashes of muzzle flame. Marines would hold the crest by firepower and positioning during the night, then cling to it during daylight, when the ridgetop became an exposed firing range for Japanese artillery and machine guns in the surrounding hills. Casualties mounted on both sides. The Marines were being chewed away by constant combat, by the exposure, by the psychological pressure of being isolated on a ridgetop with enemy fire coming from 3 directions. The Japanese, meanwhile, were suffering losses that became increasingly catastrophic because they had no reserves left and no way to replace the men who fell attacking the ridge. By the 8th of June, infantry units had finally fought their way up the slope and established a continuous supply line to the crest of Kunishi Ridge. The isolation was broken, but the fighting did not ease. The Japanese, accepting that the ridge could not be held, began the process of withdrawing to the next set of defensible terrain further south. Yuza-dake and Yaiju-dake, 2 more ridges rising out of the southern landscape, became the new focus of the retreat. These positions were smaller, more compartmentalized, less defensible than Kunishi had been, but they offered the same basic advantage: high ground in a landscape where high ground was life. American forces pursued, but the pace of pursuit was dictated by the terrain and the exhaustion of the men doing the pursuing. The 1st Marine Division, the 6th Marine Division, and the Army's 24th and 96th Infantry Divisions all advanced south, all reducing their areas of responsibility, all compressing the Japanese into a tighter and tighter pocket. What characterized this final phase of the Okinawa campaign was the absence of any neat conclusion. The Japanese 32nd Army was not being defeated in a climactic battle or a decisive moment of maneuver. Instead, it was being ground away, position by position, ridge by ridge, in a series of local actions that each seemed to require the same disproportionate effort and extracted the same terrible cost. Kunishi Ridge was representative, a position that probably could not have been held no matter how determined the defense. A position that cost both armies far more to capture or surrender than the military value of the terrain itself could justify. Yet these were the only terms on which the battle was being fought by early June. The Japanese had no more organized defensive belts, no more lines that stretched across the island, no more room for operational maneuver. What remained was a series of fortified hills and ridges, each one a private battle, each one demanding the full resources of a division or regiment to overcome. The American command structure understood that the war's end was coming, but they could not permit the Japanese 32nd Army to maintain even a small corner of Okinawa as a base for continued resistance. The rains that had plagued the entire campaign reached their crescendo in early June, turning the landscape into an almost lunar terrain of mud and exposed stone. Roads became rivers. Supply trucks could not advance. Medical evacuation became a nightmare of carrying stretchers through mud that pulled at their feet with every step. Artillery, the American advantage that had sustained the campaign from the beginning, became less effective as ammunition trucks bogged down and gun positions became muddied platforms where precision became impossible. Yet the American army kept advancing, not because the conditions improved, but because officers and men understood that this was the last phase, that beyond Yuza-dake and Yaiju-dake, there was nothing but the southern tip of the island, and beyond that was either surrender or the end. The Japanese soldiers on those final ridges, themselves reduced to fragments of units, living in caves and bunkers that had become waterlogged and miserable, understood the same thing. They had no reinforcements coming. No supplies were reaching them. The only path forward was deeper into the island's interior, further from any hope of extraction or relief. Yet they continued to fight because they were soldiers, and because the orders had never come to stop. The fall of Kunishi Ridge and the retreat toward the final ridges represented the moment when the Battle of Okinawa transformed from a campaign with military objectives and strategic purpose into something closer to a pursuit. The outcome had been determined, though it would take 8 more weeks and thousands more casualties for that determination to be finalized. The Japanese 32nd Army, which had entered the battle with approximately 70,000 men, was now compressed into the southern 10 kilometers of the island, reduced to perhaps 30,000 effectives, supplied not at all, reinforced not at all, abandoned by both the Navy and the Air Force that had once promised to defend the island. Yet Ushijima had not yet issued the orders that would permit surrender. That moment was still ahead, just beyond the next ridge, just past the next night of fighting, in the darkness and mud of early June, as men on both sides learned for what would be the last time what it meant to hold and take a piece of ground that had cost far more than any ground should cost. The Battle of Okinawa was not a war fought in a vacuum by soldiers and sailors alone. Beneath the artillery barrages and between the desperate assaults on ridgelines stood a population that had called this island home for centuries. The Okinawans, distinct in culture, language, and identity from mainland Japan, found themselves trapped in a catastrophe not of their making, squeezed between two militaries, locked in existential struggle. By the spring of 1945, more than 500,000 civilians lived on Okinawa. They had endured years of war on the periphery, watching the American advance across the Pacific with a mixture of fear and resignation. But nothing they had experienced prepared them for what was about to unfold. In the months before the American landings, Japanese military planners had made a fateful decision. Civilians would become part of the fortress. The Imperial Japanese Army, desperate to marshal every possible resource in defense of the home islands, incorporated Okinawa's entire civilian population into the war effort. From the moment the invasion fleet was spotted on the horizon, the carefully constructed world of Okinawan civilian life began to collapse. The Japanese military began systematic evacuation of civilians from the northern and central portions of the island, moving them southward toward Naha and the villages beyond where the Shuri line had been constructed. These evacuations were not orderly relocations, arranged with compassion or forethought. Families were given hours or days to abandon homes their ancestors had occupied for generations. Their livestock left to starve or roam wild, their fields abandoned to the advancing armies. The roads south quickly became choked with the elderly, the infirm, children, and mothers pushing carts laden with whatever possessions they could carry. In the chaos of movement, families were separated. Grandparents could not keep pace with younger members and were left behind. Parents made impossible decisions about which children they could realistically carry through the coming ordeal. The Japanese military commandeered resources meant for civilian survival. Trucks that might have carried refugees instead carried ammunition and supplies for the army. Food stocks were seized for the 32nd Army. Okinawan men, hundreds of them, were conscripted into military units or pressed into labor gangs, tasked with digging defensive positions, moving supplies, and tending the wounded. Many of these men would never see their families again. As American forces rapidly conquered the northern and central regions of Okinawa, civilians found themselves in a desperate race against the advancing front. The military had not provided sufficient shelter capacity in the south for the population being driven toward the tip of the island. Caves became the only refuge available. Okinawa's southern terrain is honeycombed with natural limestone caverns and man-made chambers carved out by the Japanese military for defensive positions and supply storage. These same caves now became prisons and sanctuaries for thousands of civilians. In some caverns, Japanese soldiers and Okinawan civilians sheltered side by side, an arrangement that was often far from benign. The caves had no sanitation, no ventilation, and no medical facilities. Diseases spread rapidly in the darkness. Dysentery ravaged the populations crowded into these underground spaces. Fever and infections took the very young and the very old. In one cave complex, hundreds of people pressed so tightly together that the weak were slowly suffocated by the weight of those surrounding them. Children cried from hunger. Japanese soldiers, already brutalized by years of fighting and indoctrinated with ideology that framed surrender as the ultimate dishonor, sometimes viewed the civilians as obstacles to be moved, or worse, as potential sources of intelligence leaks. There are documented accounts of Japanese soldiers striking or threatening Okinawan civilians who questioned orders or expressed despair about their situation. Compounding this tragedy was the propaganda campaign the Japanese military had conducted on Okinawa for months before the American invasion. Civilians had been told repeatedly that American forces practiced wholesale slaughter of non-combatants, that prisoners would be tortured and executed, that any Okinawan captured would face rape and murder. These narratives, drilled into the civilian population through military lectures and education in schools, created a catastrophic distrust of the approaching Americans. They were not told that surrender was possible, or that they might survive as prisoners of war with protections. Instead, they were given the unmistakable impression that capture meant death. For many Okinawans sheltering in caves as the American lines approached, death seemed to be the only certainty. Some chose to end their lives rather than face what they had been taught would come. In the caves near the southern tip of the island, in places that today are memorials to the dead, civilians made the irreversible decision to take their own lives and those of their children, rather than surrender to Americans they had been taught were demons. The exact number of civilian deaths by suicide in Okinawa's caves has never been precisely documented, and the subject remains sensitive in Japan and Okinawa. Conservative estimates place the number in the hundreds. Some accounts suggest it may have been as high as 1,000 or more. The suicides occurred in clusters, often triggered by false reports that American forces had reached a particular cave, or by the sound of military activity nearby. In some cases, mothers smothered their own children before taking poison themselves, believing this to be a merciful death compared to what awaited them. Grenades were sometimes distributed to families by Japanese soldiers who suggested their use. Whether these suggestions constituted coercion, mercy, or something more complex remains a question historians continue to debate. What is unquestionable is that the propaganda campaign waged by the Japanese military, designed to make civilians prefer death to capture, was devastatingly effective. The suicides in the caves represent one of the war's most tragic consequences of militarized indoctrination and the use of civilians as instruments of state policy. They stand as testimony to the human cost of ideology taken to its logical extreme. Not all Okinawans accepted the narrative they had been given. As American forces advanced southward, and the reality of military defeat became undeniable, some civilians began attempting to surrender. The American military had made no specific preparations for handling large numbers of civilian refugees amid active combat operations. Civil affairs units, relatively small groups of officers and enlisted men, tasked with military government and civilian liaison, found themselves overwhelmed by the sudden appearance of hundreds and then thousands of frightened, malnourished civilians emerging from the battle lines. These American soldiers, many of whom had expected to encounter an enemy population to be conquered, instead encountered families who were themselves victims of the war. Some American units reacted with compassion, treating civilians as non-combatants and establishing rudimentary collection points. Other units, particularly those under fire, or in the midst of intense combat, were sometimes less gentle in their handling of civilians who appeared unexpectedly from Japanese positions. There were incidents in which civilians were shot because they were mistaken for soldiers, or because the fear and chaos of battle overrode caution. These incidents were not systematized policy, but they happened with enough frequency that they added to the trauma experienced by Okinawans attempting to flee the war. As the spring turned toward early summer and American forces pushed deeper into the southern portion of the island, the military established more formal civilian collection points. These camps, although Spartan by any standard, represented safety from the worst horrors of the battle. Okinawans were separated from Japanese military personnel, given food, and provided basic medical care. American military doctors worked frantically to treat diseases and wounds among civilians who had endured weeks of exposure, malnutrition, and medical neglect. The American military also made an effort, sometimes successful and sometimes fumbling, to communicate to remaining civilian populations that surrender was possible and survival likely. Loudspeaker teams were deployed to broadcast messages in Japanese to encourage civilians still hiding in caves to come out. Military personnel were instructed to treat surrendering civilians humanely, though the effectiveness of these instructions varied. Slowly, more and more Okinawans came out of hiding and into the collection camps. Many were in shocking physical condition, starving, sick, and traumatized by weeks of living in caves and witnessing suicides, deaths from disease, and the violence of combat all around them. The American civil affairs personnel who managed the civilian camps faced unprecedented challenges. They had to feed and medicate a population that had grown to more than 100,000 by the end of the battle, nearly a quarter of Okinawa's total civilian population. They had to manage refugees from the hardest-hit southern regions, where entire villages had been reduced to rubble, or where civilians had been caught in the crossfire of repeated assaults and counter-assaults. They attempted to maintain records and facilitate the reunification of families separated by the chaos of evacuation and flight. Some officers became deeply invested in the welfare of their assigned civilian populations, learning basic phrases in the Okinawan language, negotiating with military commanders for scarce supplies, and advocating for the civilians in their care. Others treated the camps as a burden, and the Okinawans as obstacles to the main military mission. The gap between these two approaches sometimes determined whether a particular camp became a place of gradual recovery or a location of continued suffering. Disease remained a persistent killer even after civilians reached the camps. Malaria, dysentery, and respiratory infections claimed lives throughout the spring and summer of 1945, particularly among young children and the elderly. The psychological trauma experienced by Okinawan civilians extended far beyond the immediate destruction of their homes and the deaths of their family members. Many survivors bore the weight of having lived through mass suicides, or of having lost children and parents to disease and combat. Some had been forced to assist the Japanese military, digging fortifications or carrying supplies, and felt complicit in the deaths caused by Japanese military operations. Others struggled with complicated feelings toward their American liberators, who had destroyed their island while simultaneously rescuing them from Japanese military control. The war had fundamentally altered what it meant to be Okinawan. For centuries, Okinawa had maintained a distinct cultural identity while remaining part of the Japanese political order. The Battle of 1945 began a process that would eventually reshape this relationship entirely. In the immediate aftermath of the fighting, however, survivors were too preoccupied with the basic tasks of survival to consider broader questions of political identity. They emerged into a landscape that had been utterly transformed. Southern Okinawa, where most of the combat had occurred, and where most of the civilian population had been concentrated, was largely destroyed. Villages were reduced to rubble, crops were gone, livestock had been consumed or killed. The infrastructure of civilian life, homes, schools, temples, marketplaces, had been obliterated or heavily damaged. By the time organized Japanese resistance ended in late June of 1945, the American military estimated that approximately 100,000 Okinawan civilians had died. Later historical research has suggested this figure may have been somewhat higher, perhaps reaching 120,000 or more, roughly 1/4 of Okinawa's entire civilian population before the invasion. This death toll resulted from multiple causes. Some deaths occurred directly from American artillery and air attack, as civilians were killed alongside Japanese military positions they were unable to avoid. Many more resulted from disease, malnutrition, and exposure during the weeks of hiding in caves and displacement. Suicides account for a portion of the deaths. Japanese military violence, whether deliberate or arising from the chaos and brutality of combat, accounted for additional losses. The precise breakdown of these causes remains disputed, particularly in regard to the extent to which Japanese military actions directly caused civilian deaths, versus how many resulted from the general chaos and desperation of the battle. What is unambiguous is the scale of the civilian catastrophe and its irreversible impact on Okinawan society. The treatment of Okinawan civilians during and after the battle established a pattern that would characterize American military occupation of the island for the next 3 decades. The United States, having conquered Okinawa militarily, assumed responsibility for its civilian population and governance. This responsibility was sometimes exercised with genuine concern for civilian welfare, and sometimes with indifference or contempt. American soldiers who had fought on Okinawa and witnessed the battle's ferocity sometimes extended compassion to the civilians they found in the camps. Others, traumatized by the intensity of the fighting and losses among their units, viewed Okinawans with resentment or suspicion. The Civil Affairs Administration of Okinawa oscillated between efforts at genuine recovery and reconstruction, and periods of neglect. Okinawans who had expected liberation from Japanese military rule sometimes found themselves under foreign military control instead. The memory of 1945 became central to modern Okinawan identity in ways that continue to shape the island and its relationship with Japan and the United States. The war, which ended in August of 1945 with Japan's surrender, had already reshaped the world in which Okinawans would live for the rest of the 20th century. The 3 million or more soldiers and sailors deployed to the Pacific War remained imprinted with the experiences of Okinawa. For the American public, Okinawa's casualty figures, both military and civilian, became central to the ongoing debate about whether atomic weapons should be used against Japan and whether the war might have been concluded differently. By the final week of June 1945, the war on Okinawa was becoming something other than war. It was becoming the slow, systematic erasure of an army that had nowhere to go and no way to leave. The Japanese 32nd Army, under General Mitsuru Ushijima, had been pushed back and back across the island's southern landscape until its soldiers found themselves crowded into a peninsula that grew smaller each day, a space measured in kilometers that kept shrinking as American artillery fire and infantry assaults closed in from every direction. The units that remained were no longer units in any meaningful sense. They were fragments, remnants, desperate groups of men wedged into caves and crevasses and shallow trenches, many of them wounded, most of them low on ammunition, all of them understanding that surrender was not an option their culture or their command structure permitted. The weather had turned hot and humid. The rains had briefly lifted, and the smell of uncollected bodies lay across the landscape like an additional weapon. American forces controlled the airspace completely now. Japanese supply could not reach the southern pocket except by submarine, and those missions were sporadic and could carry almost nothing. What happened in these final days was not a battle in the conventional sense. It was a slow, grinding destruction of men, with nowhere to retreat and nothing to surrender to but their own deaths. General Ushijima had moved his command post from cave to cave as American forces overran his previous positions, and by late June his headquarters had relocated to a cave near the village of Mabuni in the extreme southern tip of the Oroku Peninsula. The general had been born in the Meiji era, educated in the military academy alongside other officers who would rise high or die high across the Pacific War, and he had come to Okinawa understanding that this was likely the last battle he would command. Unlike some Japanese generals, Ushijima was not a fanatic ideologue shouting slogans about glorious death and eternal spirit. He was a professional officer who had observed American industrial capacity firsthand and harbored no illusions about Japan's strategic position. Yet, he had prosecuted the defense of Okinawa with skill and determination, making every American soldier pay a price in blood, and he had kept his army cohesive far longer than anyone had predicted. His chief of staff, Major General Isamu Cho, was a different personality altogether. Cho was known as a fiery ideologue, a man who believed in the spiritual power of the warrior code, and who had advocated for aggressive offensive action throughout the campaign. The two men made a balanced command team, the general's steady professionalism balanced against the chief of staff's aggressive zeal, and their relationship had been marked by genuine mutual respect despite their philosophical differences. By the last week of June, their professional relationship was about to end in a way that would bind them together in Japanese military history. The American 10th Army, pushing into the southern pocket, knew it was entering the final phase. The scale of organized resistance was clearly diminishing, though the desperation seemed to intensify as Japanese soldiers and civilian workers realized they were fighting for their lives in the most literal sense. General Simon Bolivar Buckner commanded the American 10th Army, a tall, lean officer from Kentucky who had learned his trade in the island campaigns and had directed this entire operation with growing competence as the weeks progressed. Buckner was a careful commander who believed in mass and firepower and the systematic destruction of Japanese positions through overwhelming force applied methodically rather than recklessly. He had lost thousands of men taking Okinawa, and the knowledge of their sacrifice weighed on him, but he had also kept his casualties lower than many had feared and had maintained a high degree of unit cohesion and morale despite the grinding nature of the fighting. By late June, Buckner could see the end approaching, and he began moving closer to the forward positions, observing the endgame himself rather than relying on reports from subordinate commanders. This was not unusual behavior for American commanders in this war, but it was a choice that would have